Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most astonishing transformations. A story of a nobody who became the most powerful woman on earth. But here is what they never told you in school. She was not supposed to win. She was not even Russian. She was a broke German teenager with no army, no money, and a husband who despised her. Yet somehow she outsmarted an empire. And the way she did it, well, that is the part that will keep you up tonight. So, before we dive deep into this incredible story together, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history with me, the scandals, the strategies, the secrets they conveniently left out of your textbooks, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if it grabs you, and honestly, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you cozy in bed in California, lying on your couch in London? I genuinely love hearing from you. And hey, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us step back in time together. Ready? Let us begin. April 21st, 1729, a baby girl was born in a freezing castle in Stettin, a city you've probably never heard of in what is now Poland, but was then Prussia. Her name was Sophie, not Catherine, Sophie. And if you had seen this baby that day, if you had looked at her family's crumbling estate and empty treasury, you would have laughed at the idea that she would one day rule the largest empire on earth. Because here is the thing. Sophie's family was noble in name only. They had the title sure. Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst. Sounds impressive, right? But they were broke. Not we need to budget this month broke, genuinely impoverished. The kind of a noble family that had to choose between heating the castle or feeding the servants. Sophie's mother, Princess Johanna, was the only thing keeping them afloat. She had connections, good bloodlines, the kind of family tree that meant something in 18th century Europe, and Johanna was ambitious, ruthlessly so. She looked at her daughter, this bright, curious little girl, and she saw one thing, a bargaining chip, a way out, a lottery ticket. Now I want you to imagine being Sophie. You're 14 years old, 14. You're fluent in French and German. You've been drilled in religion, music, history, all the things a proper princess should know. But you've also been told over and over that your family needs you to marry well. Not for love, not for happiness, but for survival. The pressure on this teenager's shoulders was immense, and then one day an invitation arrives that changes everything. Empress Elizabeth of Russia is looking for a wife for her nephew, the heir to the Russian throne. His name is Peter, and Johanna knows this is their shot, their only shot. So, in January 1744, in the dead of winter, 15-year-old Sophie and her mother climb into a carriage and begin the long, freezing journey to Russia. Sophie had no idea that she would never see her homeland again, never. For the remaining 52 years of her life, she would not once return to Germany. Think about that for a moment. 15 years old, leaving everything you have ever known, heading to a foreign country where you do not speak the language, to marry a boy you've never met, to become part of a family that could kill you if you step out of line. And when Sophie finally met Peter, it was a disaster. She later wrote in her memoirs, and yes, she wrote memoirs, we will get to that she found him immediately detestable. Those are her words, detestable. He was pale, sickly, obsessed with toy soldiers, and had a drinking problem at 16 years old. 16, they stayed at opposite ends of the palace. She could not stand him. But here is where it gets interesting, where you start to see the brilliance forming in this young girl's mind, because Sophie realized something crucial. She might not be able to control who Peter was, but she could absolutely control who she became. And so she made a decision that night, a decision that would define her entire life. She was going to become more Russian than the Russians. Think about the audacity of that. This German teenager decided she was going to out-Russian everyone at court, including the actual Russians, and she started immediately. First, she converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy. She took a new name, Catherine, not Sophia, the Russian version of Sophie. Catherine Yekaterina Alexeyevna. She studied the Orthodox faith with an intensity that shocked everyone. But it was the language that really showed her determination. Catherine did not just learn Russian, she obsessed over it. And here is the detail that absolutely floors me every time. She would wake up in the middle of the night in the freezing Russian winter, walk barefoot on the cold floor of her bedroom, and practice Russian pronunciation. Barefoot in winter in Russia. Do you understand how cold that is? She did this night after night after night, pacing back and forth, whispering Russian words to herself in the dark. And you know what happened? She got pneumonia. Nearly died from it in 1744. The girl almost killed herself trying to learn Russian. But did she stop? No, she got sicker, developed pleurisy on top of the pneumonia. The cure back then was bloodletting. They would cut you open and drain your blood because they thought it would balance your humors. Medieval stuff. Catherine endured 4 bloodletting sessions in a single day. 4. And when she recovered, you know what she did? She went back to studying harder. Now, let us talk about Empress Elizabeth, because she is a crucial part of this story. Elizabeth was the one who had chosen Sophie to marry Peter. But Elizabeth had one massive problem. Peter and Catherine were not producing an heir. And in a monarchy, that is not just a problem, it is a crisis. It is your whole legitimacy. So Elizabeth started asking questions, uncomfortable questions, and eventually the embarrassing truth came out. Peter did not know how to be a husband. I am not kidding. The heir to the Russian throne, 17 years old, did not understand the basics of marital relations. Elizabeth's solution: she brought in a young widow to educate Peter. Yes, you heard that right. They brought in another woman to teach the future emperor how to be intimate with his wife. And apparently Peter proved to be a receptive student, because 9 years after their marriage, 9 years of waiting, of humiliation, of everyone at court whispering about Catherine's failure to produce an heir, she finally became pregnant. On October 1st, 1754, Catherine gave birth to a son. They named him Paul. He was the heir to Russia, the future emperor. Everyone celebrated. But here is the secret that Catherine later revealed, a secret that would haunt Russian history. She claimed Paul was not Peter's son. She said the father was Sergei Saltykov, a handsome young officer at court, her lover, which would mean the entire Romanov line from that point on was illegitimate. Now, historians actually debate this. Some say she was telling the truth. Others say she made it up later to undermine Paul when they had their falling out. And here is the funny part. The evidence against Catherine's claim: Paul grew up looking exactly like Peter, stout, ugly, kind of awkward, whereas Catherine and Sergei were both reportedly gorgeous. So basically, historians debunked this scandal using 18th century hot or not. If that does not make you smile, I do not know. Hat will. But think about what those 9 years must have been like for Catherine. 9 years of failure in everyone's eyes. 9 years of whispers of Empress Elizabeth's disappointment, of wondering if she would be sent away, divorced, disgraced. And she could not control Peter, could not fix him, could not force him to be someone he was not. But what she could control was herself, her education, her relationships, her reputation. And so while Peter played with his toy soldiers and got drunk, Catherine read. She read everything. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Tacitus. She read books on philosophy, on power, on politics. She was not just learning Russian language and culture. She was learning how empires worked, how power really functioned. And she was building relationships carefully, strategically, with the right people, the military officers, the noble families, the people who actually ran Russia. See, here is what I find so fascinating about this period of Catherine's life, those early years in Russia before she took power. She was in what most people would consider an impossible situation. Foreign born, no power base, married to an idiot, constantly watched and judged. Most people in that position would have given up, or at least just accepted their fate as a decorative princess. But Catherine Catherine was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. She understood something profound about power. It is not about your starting position. It is about patience, strategy, and being ready when your moment comes, because here is the real lesson from this part of Catherine's story, the part they never emphasize in history class. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is wait. Not passive waiting, active waiting, learning, building, preparing. Catherine spent nearly 18 years preparing. 18 years of humiliation, of being looked down on, of watching her husband make a fool of himself and embarrass her. And she could have lashed out, could have complained, could have demanded better treatment. But she did not. She smiled, she studied, she made allies, and she waited. And that patience, that calculated strategic patience, it was about to pay off in the most spectacular way imaginable. Because in 1762, Peter would finally become emperor, and his reign would last exactly 6 months before Catherine made her move. But how does a foreign bee-born woman with no army overthrow the Emperor of Russia? How does she convince the most powerful military in Europe to follow her instead of their crowned emperor? Well, that is where our story gets really interesting. And that is exactly what we're going to explore next. Because the coup that Catherine pulled off, the speed, the precision, the sheer boldness of it is one of the most brilliant power grabs in human history. So stay with me, because you are not going to believe what happens next. So, you're probably wondering, what was it actually like to be married to Peter? I mean, we talked about him being detestable, about the toy soldiers, about his drinking. But let me paint you a fuller picture, because the reality was so much stranger and sadder than you might imagine. Picture this. You're Catherine, now in your 20s. You've done everything right. You've learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, produced an heir. You've played by all the rules, and your reward, you get to watch your husband play with dolls. No, seriously, Peter had a massive collection of toy soldiers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and he was not just casually interested. He was obsessed. He would spend entire days arranging them in battle formations on tables in his rooms, staging elaborate military campaigns. A grown man, the future Emperor of Russia, playing with action figures. But here is where it gets truly bizarre. Peter had a dog, little rat terrier. And one day this dog did what dogs do. It knocked over some of Peter's toy soldiers during one of his imaginary battles. And Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, put the dog on trial. An actual trial. He had a little court-martial set up, complete with tiny judge and jury made of toys. He found the dog guilty of treason and had it hanged. Hanged a dog for knocking over toys. Can you imagine being Catherine watching this happen? Watching your husband execute a dog for interrupting his playtime and having to keep a straight face because you're at the Russian court and showing disrespect to the Grand Duke? Could get you exiled or worse. But Peter's obsession with toy soldiers was nothing compared to his worship of Frederick the Great of Prussia. And I need you to understand how problematic this was. Russia and Prussia were enemies. They'd been fighting for years in what historians call the 7 Years' War. Russian soldiers were dying, fighting Prussian soldiers, and Peter had a shrine to Frederick in his room. Paintings, portraits, busts. He would talk about Frederick like other men talked about gods. He studied every battle Frederick fought. He wanted to be Frederick. He dressed in Prussian military uniforms at the Russian court. Do you see the problem here? Catherine would later write about watching Peter drill his servants like Prussian soldiers, making them march up and down hallways for hours, screaming at them in German. And she had to sit there, the Grand Duchess of Russia, watching her husband cosplay as the enemy, while real Russian soldiers died on actual battlefields. The humiliation was constant, relentless, and it was not just private. Everyone at court saw it. Everyone knew. Now, I want to pause here because I think we need to talk about what this kind of relationship does to a person psychologically. Catherine was trapped. Completely trapped. In the 18th century, there was no divorce for royalty. Not really. Especially not if you were the foreign-born wife who needed to produce heirs. She could not leave, could not complain, publicly, could not even confide in most people because anything she said could be used against her. She was in a gilded cage with a man-child who alternated between ignoring her and humiliating her, and the isolation was profound. Think about it. She was hundreds of miles from home in a country where she would always be seen as foreign, married to a man who did not love her and who she could not love. Empress Elizabeth watched her constantly, suspicious of everything she did. The other courtiers saw her as an outsider. She had to be careful about who she befriended, what she said, how she acted. One wrong move, and she could lose everything. So what did Catherine do? She built herself an escape that no one could take away from her. She read, and not just casual reading. We're talking about a systematic self-education program that would make modern graduate students exhausted just thinking about it. While Peter played with toys, Catherine was reading Plato, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Tacitus. She read political philosophy, history, law, science. She read in French, in German, and increasingly in Russian. She was essentially giving herself a university education in political theory and statecraft. And here is what I find so moving about this. Reading was not just educational for Catherine. It was survival. Every book was a window out of her prison. Every philosophical text was a conversation with minds greater than anyone at the Russian court. When she read Voltaire's ideas about enlightened governance, when she studied Montesquieu's theories about separation of powers, she was not just learning abstract concepts. She was imagining a different Russia, a Russia she might some. Ide lead, a Russia where reason and progress mattered more than toy soldiers and Prussia worship. There is this letter she wrote much later after she became Empress where she said, "I arrived in Russia with no preconceptions. I was very well disposed to believe whatever I was told to believe and to do whatever was demanded of me. But then," she said something really telling, "but the utter vacancy in which I was left and my isolation led me to observe, to study, and to profit from every circumstance. Utter vacancy, that is how she described her marriage. Empty. But she turned that emptiness into opportunity." Now let us compare this to other political marriages in history because I think it helps us understand just how uniquely terrible Catherine's situation was. Take Marie Antoinette and Louis V, 16th of France, also an arranged marriage, also had problems in the bedroom initially, also ended badly. But Louis, for all his faults, was not actively cruel to Marie Antoinette. He was awkward and indifferent, sure, but not sadistic. Or look at Eléonine of Aquitaine and Louis VI. That marriage failed, but Eléonine got an annulment and went on to marry Henry II and became one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. She had options eventually, but Catherine had something different. She had a husband who was not just incompetent but actively destructive. Peter did not just ignore Russia's interests, he worked against them. He did not just fail to love Catherine, he seemed to enjoy humiliating her. There is this incident that really captures it. At a dinner party in front of the entire court, Peter called Catherine a fool, out loud at the dinner table. He got drunk as usual and just started mocking her intelligence in front of everyone. And Catherine had to sit there, smile, and pretend it did not hurt because showing weakness at the Russian court was dangerous. Do you know what that does to a person? Being called stupid in public when you're actually the smartest person in the room. When you've been reading political philosophy, while your husband plays with toys, it creates this fascinating combination of rage and determination, and you can see it in how Catherine started to move slowly, carefully. She began cultivating relationships with people who mattered, military officers who were tired of losing wars because of Peter's pro-Russia stance, nobles who saw Peter's immaturity and worried about Russia's future, court officials who recognized Catherine's intelligence even if they could not acknowledge it openly. She was not plotting a coup, not yet, but she was building a network, a foundation, because Catherine understood something that Peter never did. Power in Russia did not actually come from the crown. It came from the army, the nobility, and the Orthodox Church. and Peter was alienating all three. The army hated him because of his Prussia worship. The nobility was nervous because he was unpredictable and kept threatening their privileges. The church was suspicious because he talked about Protestant ideas and made fun of Orthodox traditions. Peter was systematically destroying every pillar that held up the Russian throne, and he had no idea he was doing it. Meanwhile, Catherine was doing the opposite. She attended Orthodox services faithfully. She learned Russian customs and celebrated them. She was respectful to the nobility. She befriended the military officers' wives. She was becoming Russian in a way that Peter, who was actually born closer to Russia than Catherine was, would never manage. And here is the modern parallel that I think is so relevant. How many times have you seen someone in a position they did not earn? Someone incompetent and arrogant, making life miserable for everyone around them. Maybe it is a boss who got promoted because of connections. Maybe it is a colleague who takes credit for others' work. Maybe it is a leader who values loyalty over competence. Peter was that person at the highest possible level, and Catherine was the competent one who had to smile and pretend she did not notice. But Catherine was learning something crucial. During these years of humiliation, she was learning exactly what not to do. Every stupid decision Peter made, every bridge he burned, every ally he alienated, she was taking notes, mental notes. She was studying power by watching someone spectacularly fail at wielding it. There is this concept in leadership theory called learning from negative examples. Sometimes the best teacher is watching someone do everything wrong. And Peter was a masterclass in how to lose an empire. He taught Catherine through his failures exactly how fragile power really is, how it depends on relationships, on perception, on knowing when to be strong and when to be subtle. Peter had the title, the crown, the authority, but he had no idea how to actually use power. And Catherine was learning that having power and knowing how to use it are two completely different things. By 1761, things were reaching a breaking point. Empress Elizabeth was dying. Everyone knew it, and everyone also knew that when Peter became emperor, things were going to change drastically and not in a good way. Catherine could feel it. The tension, the worry, the way people looked at Peter and then looked at her, as if calculating, as if wondering, as if asking themselves a question they could not quite voice. Is there another way? And then in January 1762, Elizabeth died. Peter became Emperor Peter III of Russia, and Catherine's worst fears began to come true immediately because now Peter had ultimate power, and he was about to use it in ways that would shock the empire and give Catherine the opening she'd been preparing for, perhaps without even fully realizing it, for 18 years. But we're going to explore exactly how that happened, how Peter's 6-month reign became a case study in political self-destruction, and how Catherine turned her greatest weakness, being underestimated, into her greatest weapon. January 1762, Peter III was finally emperor. And you know what his first official act was? Within days of becoming the most powerful man in Russia, he ended the war with Prussia. Just like that. Russia had been fighting Prussia for 7 years. Thousands of Russian soldiers had died. Russia was actually winning. They had captured Berlin. The Prussian king, Frederick the Great, was on the verge of defeat. Russia was about to become the dominant power in Europe, and Peter gave it all away for nothing. Let me be clear about what this meant. Russia withdrew from all conquered territories. Peter returned everything Russia had won. He offered Frederick 12,000 Russian troops to fight against Austria, Russia's ally. He essentially switched sides in the middle of a war. Imagine being a Russian general who had just captured enemy territory, lost men under your command, and then your new emperor tells you to give it all back and go fight for the enemy. How would you feel? Frederick the Great himself could not believe his luck. He had been ready to surrender. His treasury was empty. His army was exhausted. Prussia was about to collapse. And then Peter saved him. Frederick later said, and this is a real quote, Peter allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. Even the man Peter worshipped thought he was pathetic. But here is what Peter did not understand. What he could not understand, because he had spent his whole life playing with toys instead of learning about power. In Russia, the military was everything. The army had put the Romanovs on the throne. The AR. I kept them there. And Peter had just spat in the face of every officer, every soldier, every family that had lost someone in that war. He had made their sacrifices meaningless for his crush on Frederick the Great. Catherine watched this happen, and she was terrified because she knew what was coming next. Peter had always resented her, always. She was smarter than him, more popular, more Russian, and now that he had absolute power, he started making it very clear that she was no longer going to be Empress. He talked openly about divorcing her, about marrying his mistress Elizabeth Varon over, about sending Catherine to a convent or worse. There are reports from courtiers that Peter would humiliate Catherine at dinners, force her to toast to his mistress, mock her in front of foreign ambassadors. He was not just cruel, he was publicly dismantling her position. And Catherine knew that once he officially divorced her or locked her away, she would have no protection, no future. She might even meet with an accident. It happened all the time in royal courts. Inconvenient people just disappeared. So Catherine made a choice, the most dangerous choice of her life. She started actively building a conspiracy, not just cultivating relationships anymore, plotting a real coup, an overthrow of the emperor, which if discovered would mean execution, not exile, not imprisonment, death, and probably a very unpleasant death. That was the price of failure. But she had allies now, real allies, and the most important were the Olaf brothers. Grigory, Alexei, and their 3 other brothers. 5 brothers total, all military officers, all connected, all loyal to Catherine. And Gregory Olaf was not just an ally, he was Catherine's lover. They had started their affair in 1760, while Elizabeth was still alive, and Catherine had even given birth to his son Alexei in April 1762. She had hidden pregnancy, faked illness, and had a loyal servant set his own house on fire across town as a distraction so she could give birth in secret. Can you imagine the stress being pregnant with your lover's child while your husband is about to become emperor and is already talking about divorcing you? But Gregory Olaf was more than just a romantic partner. He was a hero to the soldiers. He had fought in the 7 Years' War, been wounded multiple times, was known for bravery and loyalty, and his brothers were equally influential in the military. If the Olafs were on your side, you had the army, or at least a significant part of it. The conspiracy grew slowly. Catherine was careful, so careful they could not move too fast or involve too many people. Every new person brought into the plot was a risk, someone who might panic, might betray them, might tell the wrong person. They needed the Ismailovsky Regiment, one of the most elite guards units. They needed the Sinovsky Regiment. They needed the support of key nobles. And they needed timing, perfect timing. Because here is the thing about coups, and this is true throughout history, whether we're talking about ancient Rome or modern revolutions, the window of opportunity is usually tiny. You have to move when your enemy is weak, but before they realize they are weak. Too early, and you do not have enough support. Too late, and they have shored up their defenses. The timing has to be perfect. And Peter kept giving them opportunities. He alienated the Orthodox Church by mocking their traditions and suggesting reforms that sounded suspiciously Protestant. He freed the nobility from mandatory state service, which sounds good, but it actually made them nervous because it changed the fundamental social contract. He talked about confiscating church lands. He paraded around in Prussian uniforms. Every decision made someone new angry, to someone new, willing to listen to alternatives. By summer 1762, the conspiracy was ready. They had the military support. They had the plan. They were just waiting for the right moment. And then, on the night of July 8th, everything went wrong. One of the conspirators, a captain named Pack, was arrested. Someone had talked or been suspicious, and Peter's agents grabbed him. And suddenly the conspiracy was about to be exposed. Within hours, Pack would be interrogated. He might talk, he might give names. The whole plot could unravel. They were out of time. Catherine was at Peterhof, a palace outside St. Petersburg. Peter was at Iranian-bound, another palace, drinking and partying with his Holstein courtiers. And at 6 a.m. on July 9th, Alexei Olaf burst into Catherine's bedroom and woke her up with words that must have sent her heart racing. "It is time. You must come now. Just sit with that moment for a second. You are, Catherine. You have been planning this for months. Yes, but you expected more time, more preparation, and now you are being told it is happening right now, this morning. Either you become Empress or you die trying. No middle ground. No going back." She got dressed. She got in a carriage with Alexei Olaf, and they raced towards St. Petersburg, toward the Izmailski regiment barracks. This was the gamble. If the soldiers supported Peter, Catherine would be arrested within the hour and probably executed by nightfall. If they supported her, well, then everything changed. They arrived at the barracks. Catherine stepped out of the carriage and she did something brilliant. She did not demand. She did not command. She asked. She went to the soldiers and she said simply, "They want to kill me. Will you protect me?" Think about the psychology of that. She did not say, "I am overthrowing the emperor." She said, "I need protection." She made it about defending her, not attacking Peter. She put the moral weight on the soldiers' side, and it worked. A priest came forward and blessed her. The soldiers knelt. They swore allegiance one regiment. Then they marched to the Sinovsky barracks. Those soldiers joined too. Then the Preobrazhensky regiment. Within hours, Catherine had 14,000 troops behind her. And here is what absolutely fascinates me about this coup. It was bloodless at this point. Anyway, not a single shot was fired. Peter was a Turanian bomb, completely unaware. He thought he was still emperor. He woke up that morning planning what to do about that annoying wife of his, and by noon he no longer had an empire. Catherine rode into St. Petersburg at the head of the army. She went to the Kazan Cathedral where the clergy were waiting. They proclaimed her empress and sole ruler of Russia, not regent, not co-ruler, sole ruler Catherine II. And the crowd went wild. People were celebrating in the streets because here is the thing. Peter had been emperor for 6 months and everyone hated him. Everyone. The soldiers hated him for betraying them. The church hated him for mocking them. The nobles were nervous about his erratic behavior and the common people saw him as foreign and weak. Catherine, the German princess, was somehow more Russian than the Russian-born emperor. How did that happen? Because she had spent 18 years making it happen. 18 years of learning the language, practicing the faith, respecting the traditions, building the relationships. She had become Russian through sheer will and effort, and now Russia was choosing her. Peter, meanwhile, finally got the news, and his response was so pathetic it would be funny if it were not so tragic. He panicked, completely fell apart. He tried to rally troops, but no one came. He tried to negotiate, offering to share power with Catherine. She refused. He tried to flee to Prussia, but LD not organize it. And finally, on July 9th, the same day Catherine took power, Peter signed a document of abdication. He gave up the throne. After 6 months without a fight, Frederick the Great, the man Peter had worshipped his entire adult life, the man he had saved from defeat, heard about this and made that quote I mentioned earlier about Peter being dethroned like a child being sent to bed. Even Frederick, who benefited from Peter's incompetence, thought he was ridiculous. Now let us step back and analyze why this coup succeeded when so many others in history have failed catastrophically, because it is not just about having soldiers. Lots of failed coups had military support. It is not just about the ruler being unpopular. There have been many unpopular rulers who kept their thrones. So what made this different? First, Catherine had legitimacy. She was the mother of the heir Paul. She could claim to be acting on his behalf as regent. That mattered. Second, she had been patient. 18 years of preparation, building relationships. Slowly, carefully, no rushed moves. Third, she moved decisively when the moment came. No hesitation on July 9th. Fourth, She understood Russian culture in a way Peter never did. She gave the people what they wanted, a ruler who respected Russia. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, Peter had isolated himself so completely that when the crisis came, he had no one. Catherine had everyone. There is a lesson there about power that applies way beyond 18th century Russia. Power is not about the title or the crown or the office. It is about relationships, networks, trust, legitimacy. You can have all the formal authority in the world, but if people do not follow you, you have nothing. And Peter had nothing. While Catherine, who technically had no authority at all, had everything. But here is where the story takes a dark turn, because Catherine was now Empress. Yes, the coup had been bloodless and successful. Yes, but there was a problem, a big problem. Peter was still alive. And as long as he was alive, he was a potential rallying point for opposition, a legitimate alternative, someone who could be used by Catherine's enemies to challenge her rule. And 8 days after the coup, Peter III died under very suspicious circumstances. And the question that would haunt Catherine for the rest of her reign was simple. Did she order his murder? Did she know it was going to happen? And what really occurred in that room where the former emperor took his last breath? July 17th, 1762, 8 days after Catherine became empress. And on that day, in a small palace called Rockshire, about 30 miles outside St. Petersburg, former Emperor Peter III died. He was 34 years old. The official cause of death, hemorrhoidal colic, which is a fancy 18th century way of saying complications from hemorrhoids, and if you believe that, I have a bridge in St. Petersburg to sell you. Let me walk you through what we actually know. After Peter abdicated on July 9th, Catherine had him taken to Rupture Palace. It was isolated, secure, easy to guard. Peter was kept there under what we might generously call house arrest, and the people guarding him, Alexei Orlov and his men. Alexei, remember, was the brother of Gregory Orlov, Catherine's lover, and the man who had helped orchestrate the coup. So already we're not exactly talking about a neutral security detail here. We have a letter, an actual historical document. Alexei Orlov wrote it to Catherine on July 17th, and it has survived. Let me read you part of it because the language is absolutely chilling. Little mother, merciful sovereign, how can I explain what has happened? You will not believe. Your faithful servant, but before God, I will speak the truth. Little mother, I am ready to go to my death, but I myself do not know how this misfortune occurred. We are lost if you do not have mercy. Read that again. I myself do not know how this misfortune occurred. What does that even mean? He goes on to describe Peter getting into a fight with other guards during dinner and how they tried to separate everyone, but somehow Peter ended up dead. Just somehow, an accident, he claims, a terrible accident. But here is what makes this so suspicious. Alexei Orlov was a soldier, a trained military officer, a man who had survived actual combat in the 7 Years' War. And we're supposed to believe he could not control a situation with one drunken former emperor and a handful of guards, that it just accidentally resulted in death. Come on. The official autopsy said hemorrhoidal colic with severe inflammation causing apoplexy. Apoplexia is what they called strokes back then. But when historians analyzed this diagnosis later, they said that makes no sense medically. Hemorrhoids do not cause strokes in healthy 34-year-old men, not in 8 days. What causes sudden death in that time frame? Poisoning, strangulation, blunt force trauma to the head, those kinds of things. But we will never know for sure exactly what happened in that room, because everyone who was there had a motive to lie. What we do know is that Peter was alive on July 9th and dead on July 17th, and the people guarding him were loyal to Catherine. And Catherine became the undisputed ruler of Russia the moment he died. Now the big question, did Catherine know this was going to happen? Did she order it? And this is where it gets psychologically complex because we have to think about plausible deniability. Catherine was smart, the smartest person in Russia probably, and she would have known that having Peter alive was dangerous, but having him murdered was also dangerous. It created a stain on her legitimacy that would never wash off. There is this concept in political science called working toward the leader. It means that subordinates trying to please their leader will do things the leader wants without being explicitly told. They anticipate the leader's desires and act on them. Henry II of England did this with Thomas Becket. Henry complained about Becket, said something like, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And 4 knights took that as an order and murdered Becket. Henry claimed he never wanted that. Maybe he was telling the truth, maybe he was not, but the knights thought they were doing what he wanted. Did something similar happen with Catherine and Peter? Did the Olaf brothers think they were doing Catherine a favor, solving a problem she could not publicly ask them to solve? We do not have evidence that Catherine gave an explicit order, but we also do not have evidence that she did not. And the fact that Alexei Olaf felt he needed to write that letter, that defensive, nervous letter, suggests he knew this looked bad, really bad. What we do have is Catherine's reaction when she found out, and this is documented. She said, "My glory is spoiled. Posterity will never forgive me. Not how terrible, not who did this, but my glory is spoiled." As if she understood immediately that this death, regardless of her involvement, would define how history remembered her. And she was right. We are still talking about it 260 years later. Think about what that statement reveals. Catherine was thinking about her legacy in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death, not about grief, not about justice, but about how this would look, which tells us something about Catherine. She was always thinking 3 steps ahead, always calculating, which is what made her a brilliant ruler. But it also makes you wonder, how much did she calculate about Peter's death? Let me give you some context by comparing this to other suspicious royal death throughout history. Edward II of England, deposed in 1327, supposedly died in Berkeley Castle under mysterious circumstances. The rumor was he was murdered with a red, hot poker in a particularly gruesome way. Edward V and his brother, the princes in the Tower, disappeared in 1483 and were probably murdered on orders from Richard III. Zarpul, the first Catherine's own son, was murdered in 1801 in a coup that his son, Alexander, almost certainly knew about in advance. Suspicious royal deaths are almost a tradition in monarchy. But here is what makes Peter's death different from those examples. In most cases, the murder was politically necessary and therefore justifiable in the eyes of those who did it. The princes in the Tower were potential rival claimants. Edward II had been deposed, but could have been restored. Paul FDHS was an erratic, dangerous tyrant. But Peter had already abdicated. He had signed the papers. He was no longer emperor. He was just a sad, pathetic former ruler locked in a palace. Killing him was not strictly necessary, it was precautionary. Unless you think about it from a different angle, what if Peter had not really accepted his deposition? What if he was plotting already, even in those 8 days? What if he was trying to communicate with Frederick the Great or with loyalists in the military? We know Frederick thought Peter was weak, but we also know Prussia benefited from having Peter instead of Catherine on the throne. What if there really was a plot to restore Peter and the Olavs found out about it? I am not saying that is what happened. I am saying we do not know, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this so haunting. Because Catherine went on to rule for 34 more years. She became one of the greatest rulers in Russian history. She expanded the empire, modernized the country, patronized the arts, corresponded with philosophers. She became Catherine the Great. But that shadow was always there, the shadow of July 17th, 1762. And you have to wonder, did it haunt her? There are moments in her later correspondence where she seems defensive about it. She insists in her memoirs that Peter's death was unexpected, that she had been planning to keep him alive in comfortable confinement, but she also does not investigate it, does not punish anyone, does not even really acknowledge the suspicious circumstances publicly. She just moves on, which could mean she was innocent and knew pursuing it would make things worse, or it could mean she was guilty and wanted it buried. Here is another angle to consider: the psychological toll. Let us say, for argument's sake, that Catherine did not order Peter's death, but suspected the Olafs did it to help her. How do you process that? You're in debt to these men for putting you on the throne. Gregory Olaf is your lover, the father of your child. His brother may have just committed murder to secure your position. Do you punish him? Do you thank him? Do you pretend you do not know? What does that do to your soul? There is a brutality to power that I think we sometimes miss when we read history books. We see the dates, the battles, the treaties, the accomplishments. We see Catherine the Great as this enlightened desperate who brought culture and progress to Russia. But we forget that the foundation of her power was built on violence, not just Peter's death. We will talk later about how she crushed peasant rebellions, about the wars she fought, about the people who suffered under her rule. But it started here with a death in a palace that was just a little too convenient. Now compare Catherine's situation to other leaders who came to power through questionable means. Look at Augustus, Caesar. He was part of the conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar, fought a civil war, and eventually became the first Roman emperor. He brought peace and prosperity to Rome, but it was built on betrayal and bloodshed. Or think about Queen Elizabeth of England. She did not personally order Mary, Queen of Scots' execution. She signed the death warrant, sure, but then claimed she never meant for it to be carried out. Plausible deniability again, and Elizabeth is remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs. The question becomes, does the end justify the means? If Catherine had not taken power, Peter would have continued to destroy Russia. He would have given more away to Prussia, alienated more allies, maybe sparked rebellions or even revolutions. From a utilitarian perspective, removing Peter, even killing him, might have been the right thing for Russia. But does that make it morally acceptable? Where is the line? And this is where I think we sitting here in the 21st century have to be honest about something. We do not actually know what we would do in Catherine's position. It is easy to judge from a distance, to say, well, I would never condone murder. But would you? If you had worked for 18 years to survive, to build a future, and suddenly you were in power, but your enemy was still alive and could come back at any moment and destroy everything, what would you do? I am not saying murder is right. I am saying that moral clarity is a lot easier when your life is not at stake. Catherine made a choice, or allowed a choice to be made on her behalf, and that choice gave her the throne but cost her something too. That statement, "My glory is spoiled," it was not just about reputation. I think it was about how she saw herself. Catherine fancied herself an enlightened ruler, a philosopher queen inspired by Voltaire and reason and progress. And here she was, Empress, because of a coup and possibly a murder. The contradiction between her ideals and her reality must have been profound. But you know what is remarkable? She did not let it destroy her. She did not spiral into guilt or paranoia or cruelty, the way some rulers do after gaining power through violence. Instead, she seemed to channel it, to prove that Peter's death, however it happened, had been worth it because of what she would accomplish. She needed to be great to justify the cost. And maybe that is why she succeeded, because she had to, because anything less would mean that death had been for nothing. There is one more thing I want to point out about this whole situation, and it is about the nature of truth in history. We will never know exactly what happened on July 17, 1762. The people who knew are all dead. The evidence is contradictory and incomplete. We can analyze, we can theorize, we can make educated guesses, but certainty that is gone. And maybe that is the real point. Power at this level exists in a realm of shadows and uncertainties. The truth gets buried deliberately or accidentally, and what survives is narrative, story, legend, and Catherine understood that. She understood that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the army, maybe more important. So, did Catherine the Great murder her husband? I cannot tell you definitively. What I can tell you is that she benefited from his death, that the people who guarded him were her allies, that the circumstances were suspicious, and that she never really tried to find out what happened. Make of that what you will. But remember this, Catherine went on to rule for 34 years, and in those years she transformed Russia. Whether that transformation justified its bloody beginning is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But there is no question that from this dark moment emerged one of the most powerful reigns in history. And the question now is, how did she use the power? What did she actually do once the throne was secure? Because the story you've been told about Catherine's lovers is probably wrong. The myths, the scandals, the whispers. There is truth there. Yes, but it is far more complex and far more interesting than the gossip suggests. Here is something that might surprise you. For over 2 centuries, Catherine the Great has been portrayed as history's most notorious nymomaniac. The rumors are wild, endless sexual appetite, dozens of lovers, orgies, depravity, and every single history class, every documentary, every pop culture reference seems to repeat these stories as fact. But let me give you some actual numbers and watch how the narrative completely changes. From 1752 to 1796, that is 44 years, Catherine had 12 romantic relationships, 12 over 44 years. Let us do the math together. That is an average of 1 relationship every 3.5 years. Most of these relationships lasted 2 years or longer. Some lasted a decade. Does that sound like a sex-crazed maniac to you? Or does it sound like someone who had serial monogamous relationships over the course of her adult life? But here is the kicker. While Catherine's 12 partners over 44 years made her a scandal, her male contemporaries were doing far worse and nobody blinked. Louis XV of France had hundreds of mistresses, literally hundreds. He had an entire mansion, the Park, dedicated to housing his conquests. Augustus the Strong of Poland claimed to have fathered over 300 children. 300, and these men are remembered as what? Virile, powerful. Meanwhile, Catherine, with her 12 relationships, is remembered as a deviant. Why? I think you know why. Because she was a woman, and worse, she was a woman with power, and there is nothing that threatens patriarchal society more than a woman who has both power and sexual agency. So they turned her into a monster. A cautionary tale. A joke. Anything to undermine what she actually accomplished. But let us talk about what was really going on with these relationships, because this is where it gets fascinating. Catherine did not just take lovers. She integrated them into her political machine. These were not random affairs. They were strategic partnerships that serve both emotional and governmental purposes. And understanding this changes everything about how we see Catherine's reign. Let us start with Stanislas Poniatowski, because his story is absolutely wild and we have not really talked about him yet. Catherine met him in 1755 when she was 26 and he was 23. He was Polish, handsome, cultured, spoke multiple languages. He was working as a diplomat in St. Petersburg, and Catherine fell for him hard. This was not some calculated political move. This was genuine passion. She was stuck in a nightmare marriage with Peter, remember? And Stanislaus was everything Peter was not. Intelligent, refined, attentive. They had an affair that lasted several years. Catherine became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, Anna, in December 1757. But the baby died after just over a year. Can you imagine the grief having a child with the man you love in secret while married to a man you despise and then losing that child? Catherine rarely wrote about Anna, but the silence speaks volumes. Now, here is where the political genius comes in. In 1763, a year after Catherine became Empress, Poland was choosing a new king. And Catherine saw an opportunity. She threw Russia's full support, military and financial, behind Stanislaus, her former lover, and she got him elected King of Poland. Think about that. She made her ex-boyfriend a king. It sounds like something out of a romance novel, except it actually happened. But Catherine's plan was not romantic. It was strategic. She thought Stanislaus would be grateful, loyal, bossy. Kali, a puppet king who would do what Russia wanted. She would control Poland through him. Brilliant, right? Except it backfired spectacularly, because Stanislaus, once he actually became king, started acting like a real king. He implemented reforms to strengthen Poland's independence. He tried to break free from Russian influence. He turned out to have principles. Who knew? Catherine was furious, betrayed. She had given him a throne, and he used it against her interests. So what did she do? She forced him to abdicate. She led the effort to partition Poland, to literally break the country into pieces and divide it among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of Europe's great powers, ceased to exist, and it was partly because Catherine's ex-boyfriend would not stay in his lane. There is something deeply human about this, right? A relationship that started with genuine love and ended with geopolitical destruction. And I think it reveals something important about Catherine. She could separate her personal feelings from political necessity. When Stanislaus stopped being useful to Russia, their past relationship did not save him. Cold, maybe, but that ruthlessness was part of what made her effective. Now, let us talk about Gregory Piempikin, because this is the relationship that really defined Catherine's emotional life. We have talked about Gregory Olof, the Coup partner, Catherine's lover, who helped put her on the throne. That relationship lasted about 10 years, from 1760 to 1772. But when it ended, when Olaf left court in 1772, Catherine briefly took another lover, Alexander Vasilchikov. And by all accounts, that relationship was boring. Vasilchikov was handsome but shallow. Catherine was not intellectually engaged. It lasted less than 2 years. And then in 774, Grigory Piemkin entered her life and everything changed. Piempikin was not conventionally attractive. He had lost her an eye in a brawl. He was moody, temperamental, brilliant, ambitious. But Catherine and Piempikin connected on a level that none of her other relationships had achieved. They were intellectual equals. They debated philosophy, discussed military strategy, or argued about policy. He challenged her in ways that both frustrated and thrilled her. And here is the thing that historians still debate. Did Catherine secretly marry Piemkin? There are hints in their correspondence. They called each other husband and wife in private letters. There are rumors of a secret Orthodox ceremony. But there is no definitive proof. If they did marry, it would have been morganatic, meaning Piemkin would not become emperor. But they would be legally wed. Why keep it secret? Because Catherine could not afford to have a husband. Her authority came from being sole ruler. A husband, even a morganatic one, would threaten that. Their relationship evolved over the years. They were passionate lovers for about 2 years, from 1774 to 1776. But even after the physical relationship ended, they remained incredibly close. Piempikin became Catherine's most important advisor, her partner in governing Russia. He led military campaigns, annexed Crimea, developed the southern territories, and Catherine trusted him in ways she trusted no one else. They wrote to each other constantly, hundreds of letters. And the intimacy in those letters is striking. Even after they were no longer sleeping together, they were emotionally bonded. There is this one letter where Piempikin is away on a military campaign. Catherine writes, "I am bored without you. I pace around these rooms and see only walls. This is the Empress of Russia, the most powerful woman in the world, admitting that she is lonely, that she misses him. It is vulnerable in a way that Catherine rarely allowed herself to be." Pempican died in 1791 and Catherine was devastated. She locked herself in her rooms for days, refused to see anyone. When she finally emerged, she had aged visibly. People at court said she never fully recovered from losing him. And I think that tells us something crucial. For all her power, for all her political brilliance, Catherine was still human. She still needed connection, companionship, love. The crown did not protect her from heartbreak. Now, after Pempican, Catherine took several other lovers, younger men mostly. Alexander Dmitri Mamov was one of them. He was in his 20s when their relationship began. Catherine was in her 50s, and here is where the gossip really intensified because society could accept a woman in her 20s or 30s having affairs. But a woman in her 50s with a younger man, that was scandalous. Disgusting, they said. Unnatural. Mamov eventually fell in love with one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a 16-year-old girl, and eloped with her. And there is a rumor, probably not true, but it circulated, that Catherine had the girl whipped as revenge. The reality is probably less dramatic. Catherine was hurt. Yes, humiliated, certainly, but she handled it with dignity. She gave the couple money and properties and sent them away from court. Not exactly the action of a vengeful monster, but the scandal points to something bigger. The double standard that Catherine faced when older kings took young mistresses, which happened constantly throughout history. It was expected, a sign of their virility. But when Catherine did the equivalent, it was proof of her depravity, and this double standard was weaponized against her by her enemies, particularly Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick, remember, had benefited enormously from Catherine's husband's stupidity. But Catherine was no fool, and Frederick knew it. He could not defeat her politically or militarily, so he attacked her reputation instead. He is the one who said, and this quote is documented about Catherine, "A woman is always a woman, and in feminine government that has more influence than a firm policy, guided by straight reason." Read that again. This is one of the most powerful men in Europe, and his criticism of Catherine, a woman who expanded Russia by 200,000 square miles, who modernized the government, who made Russia a dominant European power, was essentially, well, she's a woman, so obviously she's ruled by her genitals. The misogyny is breathtaking. And it worked. Those attitudes shaped how Catherine was remembered for centuries. Even her own son, Paul, who hated her for various reasons, passed a law after she died forbidding women from ever ascending to the Russian throne again. Think about that. Catherine ruled successfully for 34 years, transformed Russia, and her son's response was to make sure no woman could ever do it again. The sexism was institutional. But here is what I find most interesting about Catherine's approach to her lovers. She was open about them. She did not sneak around or hide them in separate palaces. She brought them to court, gave them official positions, acknowledged them publicly. Why? Because she understood that secrecy creates vulnerability. Secrets can be exposed, used as blackmail, weaponized, but if you are open about something, it loses its power to harm you. Plus, by giving her lovers governmental roles, she was actually being strategic. These men were loyal to her personally. They owed their positions to her favor, and in a court full of ambitious nobles with their own agendas, having people whose success was tied directly to yours was smart politics. Gregory Olaf became head of the artillery. Pempican became governor general of the southern territories. These were not just ceremonial titles, these were real positions of power. And the men who filled them had every incentive to make Catherine's reign successful. Compare this to how other female rulers handled similar situations. Elizabeth Thurm of England never married, never took acknowledged lovers, presented herself as the Virgin Queen. It was a different strategy, power through purity. But it also meant Elizabeth was isolated, had no intimate partners, no one she could fully trust. She died, alone, surrounded by courtiers who were already planning for her successor. Or look at Maria Theresa of Austria, Catherine's contemporary. Maria Theresa was married, had 16 children, and presented herself as the perfect wife and mother. She used traditional femininity as her source of legitimacy, and it worked for her, but it also limited her in ways that Catherine was not limited. Catherine chose a third path. She refused to pretend she did not have desires or needs. She refused to hide her humanity. And yes, it made her vulnerable to criticism and scandal, but it also made her powerful in a different way. She was living proof that a woman could have both, could be a ruler and a lover, could wield political power and enjoy personal pleasure. And that was revolutionary, threatening, unacceptable to the men who wanted to keep women in narrowly defined roles. You know what is depressing? We are still dealing with this. Think about how modern female politicians are scrutinized about their appearance, their relationships, their families in ways that male politicians are not. Think about the sexist language used against women in power. The double standards have not gone away. They have just gotten more subtle sometimes. Catherine's response to all the gossip and scandal. She kept doing exactly what she wanted. She kept taking lovers. She kept promoting them to positions of power. She kept ruling Russia brilliantly. And she proved through 34 years of successful reign that the misogynistic critics were wrong. A woman could govern with both her intellect and her heart. A woman could be powerful and passionate. A woman could refuse to apologize for being human. But there is one scandal about Catherine that has persisted more than any other. One story that seems to define her legacy in popular culture more than her actual accomplishments. And that story involves villages, a journey to Crimea, and one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Because what if I told you that one of the most famous things everyone knows about Catherine the Great is probably a complete fabrication, and that the truth of what really happened reveals something profound about how history gets written and who gets to write it. You've probably heard the phrase PM Pekin Village. It is used all the time in modern politics and business. It means a facade, something that looks impressive on the surface but is fake underneath. A show put on to deceive someone important. Companies create PM Pekin villages for investors. Politicians create them for constituents. The phrase is so common that most people do not even know where it comes from. But I am going to tell you, and then I am going to tell you why the story is almost certainly false and why that matters. The year was 1787. Catherine had been Empress for 25 years. She had just annexed Crimea in 1783, adding massive territory to Russia's southern border. And she wanted to see it. She wanted to tour these new conquests, these lands that Grigory Pumpkin had been developing and governing. So she organized what might be the most extravagant royal road trip in history. The journey took 6 months. Catherine traveled with a massive entourage. Foreign ambassadors, courtiers, servants, soldiers. We're talking about thousands of people. They went down the Dnieper River on decorated boats, then overland through the newly conquered territories. It was meant to showcase Russia's power and the success of PM Pekin's development efforts in what they called New Russia. And here is where the legend starts. According to the story that emerged later, PM Pekin knew the territories were not really developed. The villages were poor. The people were struggling. Nothing was as impressive as he had promised Catherine it would be. So he supposedly built fake villages along the route, hollow facades, painted canvas stretched over wooden frames to look like buildings. He hired peasants to dress up and wave cheerfully as Catherine passed by. Then once she moved on, they would dismantle everything and move it further down the route to reuse it. A traveling set piece, a con game on an imperial scale. It is a great story, right? It has everything: deception, ambition, theatrical flair, and it perfectly fits the narrative of Catherine as a foolish woman surrounded by scheming men who manipulated her. The idiotic Empress who was so easily fooled that her lover could literally build fake villages and she would not notice. It makes Catherine look stupid and PM Pekin look like a scheming charlatan, and that is exactly why the story was invented. Because here is the thing. Modern historians, actual academics who have studied the primary sources say, this almost certainly never happened, or at the very least it has been wildly exaggerated. Let me walk you through why. First, who started this rumor? A Saxon diplomat named Georg von Helbig. He was not even on the trip. He was not an eyewitness. He heard it from someone else and wrote about it years later in 1797, after both Catherine and PM Pekin were dead and could not defend themselves. Convenient, right? And von Helbig was representing Saxon interests which were opposed to Russian expansion. He had every motive to make Russian achievements look fake. Second, there were foreign ambassadors on this trip. The Austrian Emperor Joseph II was literally there. The French ambassador, the English envoy. These were sophisticated, educated men who had traveled extensively. Are we really supposed to believe they were all fooled by painted canvas? That, not one of them noticed they were looking at fake buildings. That not one of them mentioned it in their detailed reports back home, because we have those reports. And none of them mention fake villages. None. Third, and this is the part that makes the whole story collapse, we have evidence of what PM Pekin actually built. Archaeological evidence, records of construction. Cities that still exist today. Kursanen, founded in 1778. Nikotov, founded in 1789. Sevastopol, the massive naval base. These were not fake. These were real cities with real populations, real infrastructure, real economic activity. You cannot fake a naval base. You cannot fake a city. So what probably happened? PM Pekin likely did some beautification along the route. Maybe he had villages cleaned up, painted, decorated for Catherine's visit. Maybe he had the best dressed peasants positioned along the route. Maybe he moved some herds of cattle to be visible at strategic points. That is not a massive deception. That is what we would today call staging. It is what every modern politician does when they visit somewhere. Clean up the route, put your best foot forward, manage the optics. We do not call that fraud, we call that politics. But PM Pin's enemies took that grain of truth and exploded it into a bar-assive lie, and the lie stuck. For over 200 years, PM Pin Village has meant aberrate fakery, and most people still believe it happened. Why does this bar mem ta? Because it reveals how historical narratives get created. Anbar W.O. has the power to shape them. PM Pekin was brilliant, accomplished, effective. H developed vast territories, built cities, modernized infrastructure. BRC eated the Black Sea Fleet. These were real achievements. But his enemies, BRP, political rivals at the Russian court, foreign diplomats who opposed Russian expansion, historians with their own endas. They created a counter-narrative. They turned his accomplishments into a CNS. They made him a joke. And because he died in 1791 and could not defend H himself, that version became history. Think about the power of that. Someone do real work, accomplish real things, and still be remembered as ABRF, odd, because their enemies controlled the narrative. Does that sound familiar? HW, many times have you seen H, is happen in modern politics. Someone achieves something genuine, but their opponents spin it as fake, as theater, as smoke and mirrors. And if they repeat it enough times, loudly enough, it becomes what people believe. This is the 18th century version of fake news, misinformation, propaganda, and it worked so well that we're still falling for it over 2 centuries later. When I started researching this section, I believed the PM Pekin village story was True, because that is what I had always been told. It was only when I dug into the actual historical scholarship that I realized, wait, this is probably false. I had been repeating a lie without even knowing it, and here is where it gets even more interesting. The P.M. Pekin village myth serves a specific purpose. It undermines Catherine, because if P.M. Pekin was a fraud and Catherine fell for his deception, then she was incompetent. She was a foolish woman who could be easily manipulated. Never mind that she ruled successfully for 34 years. Never mind that she expanded the empire by 200,000 square miles. Never mind that she modernized Russia's government, legal system, and culture. If she could be fooled by fake villagers, then clearly she was not really that smart, was she? You see how the narrative works. It is not just about P.M. Pekin. It is about Catherine. It is about cutting her down, making her achievements seem less impressive, making her seem less capable. And it is the same pattern we have seen throughout her story. The sexualized rumors, the murder, accusations, the fake village legend, all designed to undermine a powerful woman. Let me give you a comparison. Napoleon Bonaparte. He lost the Russian campaign catastrophically, retreated from Moscow with his army freezing and starving. That is documented fact. But do we remember him primarily for that failure? No. We remember him as a military genius because the narrative around Napoleon focuses on his victories, his brilliance, his accomplishments. His failures are footnotes. Catherine won wars, expanded territory, never lost a major campaign. But what do we remember? Fake villages and sexual scandals. The double standard is staggering. Now let us talk about what P.M. Pekin actually accomplished, because that is the story that should have been told. When Catherine annexed Crimea and the southern territories, they were sparsely populated, underdeveloped, vulnerable. The Ottoman Empire was still a threat. These territories needed infrastructure, defense, settlers, and P.M. Pekin delivered. He founded cities, not fake ones, real cities that you can visit today. He built the Black Sea Fleet from nothing. Think about what that means. Shipyards, naval bases, trained sailors, officers, supply chains. You cannot fake a navy. He established agricultural settlements, encouraging immigration from across Europe. He built roads, ports, administrative buildings. Was all of this perfect? No. Was some of it probably exaggerated in his reports? Maybe. But was it fundamentally fake? Absolutely not. There is a historical document, a letter from Catherine to P.M. Pekin in 1787 during famous trip. She writes about how impressed she is with the development she is seeing, about the new buildings, thriving settlements, the progress. Now either Catherine was a complete fool, who could not tell real buildings from canvas, or she was seeing real development. And everything we know about Catherine suggests she was not a fool. But here is the really clever part, the P.M. Pekin village myth. It is unfalsifiable. If you point out the real cities, the infrastructure, the real accomplishments, the response is, but those were used after the trip to cover up the fraud. If you point out that foreign ambassadors did not report seeing fakes, his response is, well, they re-fooled too. If you note that there is no contemporary evidence for the fake villages, the response is, of course not. They covered it up well. It is a conspiracy theory, and like all good conspiracy theories, it is structured so that any evidence against it can be explained away. That is how you know it is probably false. Real historical events leave traces, contradictions, evidence, perfect narratives that explain everything and have no loose ends. Those are usually invented. So why did the story spread so successfully? Because it is a good story. It has drama, irony, spectacle. It is the kind of anecdote that people remember and repeat. Did you know Catherine the Great was fooled by fake villages? It is a great dinner party fact, except it is not a fact. It is a legend. But legends often have more staying power than truth, and there is a lesson in that about how we consume information today. How many stories do we believe simply because they are dramatic, because they fit our pre-existing assumptions, because they are repeated often enough by enough people? How often do we check the sources, verify the facts, consider who benefits from a particular narrative? The PM Pekin village story benefited everyone who wanted to undermine Catherine and Russian expansion. It made Russia's accomplishments seem hollow. It made Catherine seem gullible. It made PM Pekin seem corrupt. And because it was such a useful narrative for so many people, it spread. It became conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is incredibly hard to dislodge even when it is wrong. I want you to think about something for a moment. What other historical facts have you learned that might actually be myths? How many times have you repeated something you heard without checking if it is really true? I am not trying to make you paranoid about all knowledge. I'm suggesting that we should approach history with a little more skepticism, a little more curiosity about sources and motives. Because history is not just a collection of facts, it is a collection of stories. And stories are told by people with perspectives and agendas. The winners write history, yes, but so do the propagandists, so do the gossips, so do the enemies of powerful women who want to cut them down to size. Catherine understood this, by the way. She knew the rumors about her were false or exaggerated, but she also knew that fighting them directly often just gave them more attention. So she focused on accomplishments instead, on building, creating, expanding, on being so obviously competent that the lies about her would eventually be overwhelmed by reality. And to some extent it worked. She is called Catherine the Great, after all, not Catherine the Fooled, not Catherine the Fake, but the myths persisted anyway, because myths are powerful, they are sticky, they are fun to repeat, and they often reveal more about the people who tell them than about the people they are about. The PM Pekin village myth tells us that people in the 18th century and even today would rather believe a powerful woman was incompetent than accept that she was effective, that they would rather believe in elaborate fraud than in genuine accomplishment. What is sad is that PM Pekin deserves better too. He was one of the great developers and administrators of the 18th century. He transformed vast territories from frontier lands into productive regions of the empire, and his legacy should be those real cities, those real achievements. Instead, his name became synonymous with fakery. That is the power of propaganda. It can outlive the truth by centuries. But now you know better. Now you know that the PM Pekin villages were almost certainly fake news, not fake villages. And maybe that makes you wonder, what else have we been told about Catherine that is not quite true? What other scandals and legends need a second look? Well, I am glad you asked, because we need to talk about enlightenment and ideals, about the beautiful philosophy Catherine claimed to follow and the brutal reality of how power actually worked in 18th century Russia, about the paradox at the heart of her reign. How could someone so progressive, in theory, be so oppressive in practice? Imagine spending 2 years of your life writing the most progressive legal code anyone had ever seen. 526 articles laying out a vision for justice, equality, and rational government. You work on it every single day. You base it on the greatest thinkers of your time, Montesquieu, Betrayal, the philosophes of the French Enlightenment. You pour your heart into creating something that will transform your empire, that will bring reason and humanity to governance, and then you watch it fail completely. Almost nothing you proposed actually gets implemented. That was Catherine's experience with the Naz, and it reveals the central tragedy of her reign. Let me take you back to 1764. Catherine has been Empress for 2 years. Peter is dead. Her position is secure, and she is ready to actually govern. And she wants to be an enlightened ruler, not just in theory, in practice. She's been reading Voltaire since she was a teenager. She corresponds with Darrow. She sees herself as part of the Enlightenment, that grand intellectual movement sweeping Europe, and she genuinely believes she can bring those ideals to Russia. So she starts working on what she calls the instruction, the nakaz in Russian. It is supposed to guide a complete reform of Russia's legal system. The existing laws dated from 1649, over a century old, outdated, contradictory, often cruel. Catherine wants to create something new, something based on reason and humanity rather than tradition and fear. She works on this document for 2Y. Years every day, writing, revising, consulting, sources. And the result is remarkable. The nakaz proposes equal protection under lawful persons. It emphasizes preventing crime rather than punishing it harshly. It argues against torture. It suggests that the purpose of punishment should be rehabilitation, not vengeance. It even hints at limiting serfdom, though carefully, because Catherine knows that is dangerous territory. This document was revolutionary for its time. When it was published in 1767, it was widely distributed across Europe and caused a sensation. Voltaire called it the finest monument of the century. French philosophe Catherine as the ideal enlightened monarch. She'd written on paper the perfect vision of rational governance, and she was so proud of it. But here is where reality crashed into ideals. In June 1767, Catherine convened the Legislative Commission to actually implement the NAZ. She brought together representatives from across Russia, nobles, merchants, state peasants, Cossacks, even some non-Russian ethnic groups, over 500 deputies. It was supposed to be this grand democratic exercise, revising Russia's laws according to enlightened principles. It was a disaster. The commission met for a year and a half and accomplished almost nothing. Why? Because the nobles did not want reform. The merchants were more concerned with their privileges than with abstract justice. The different groups fought with each other about status and precedence. And Catherine realized something devastating. Her beautiful vision of enlightened governance ran directly into the hard reality of Russian society and Russian power. Let me give you a specific example of the contradiction. The Tsars suggested that harsh punishment should be avoided, that torture should be eliminated. Beautiful idea, right? But Russian law enforcement depended on harsh punishment and torture. The nobility used brutal methods to control their serfs. The state used torture to extract confessions. And if Catherine tried to actually eliminate these practices, she would face massive resistance from the very people who kept her in power. Or take the issue of serfdom. Catherine knew that serfdom was wrong. She had read the Enlightenment philosophers. She understood the arguments against slavery and unfreed labor. And Russian serfdom in the 18th century was in many ways worse than American slavery. Serfs were tied to their owners, not to the land. A noble could sell serfs separately from the land, breaking up families, could punish them at will, could even under Catherine's reign sentence them to hard labor in Siberia, a punishment usually reserved for criminals. Catherine actually made this worse. Under her rule, nobles gained even more power over serfs. She could not abolish serfdom without losing the support of the nobility, and the nobility was her power base. So not only did she fail to limit serfdom, she expanded it. She gave away hundreds of thousands of state peasants to nobles as rewards for service, turning free peasants into serfs, the opposite of enlightenment. Do you see the paradox? Catherine genuinely believed in Enlightenment ideals. She was not faking it. Her correspondence with Voltaire was not just for show. She really admired him, really wanted his approval, but she also understood that implementing those ideals would undermine her own power. And when forced to choose between ideals and power, she chose power every time. Let us compare this to other enlightened despots of the era, because Catherine was not alone in this contradiction. Frederick the Great of Prussia also corresponded with Voltaire, also claimed to be enlightened. But Frederick never seriously tried to limit serfdom either. He modernized the Prussian army and bureaucracy, yes, but the social Saint Russia remained feudal. Joseph II of Austria was probably the most genuine in trying to implement enlightened reforms. He did abolish serfdom in the Austrian Empire in 1781. But you know what happened? The nobles revolted. He had to back down on many of his reforms, and after he died in 1790, most of his changes were reversed. So, maybe the real question is not whether Catherine was a hypocrite, but whether enlightened despotism was even possible. Can you have a system where one person has absolute power, and that person voluntarily limits their power based on rational principles? History suggests no, because the people with absolute power got that power through force and cunning, not through rationality. And maintaining power requires making compromises that betray ideals. But Catherine tried, at least in some areas. She did reform education, creating the Small Institute for Noble Girls in 1764, the first state-funded higher education for women in Europe. That was real progress. She founded the Moscow Orphanage in 1764, which took in over 40,000 children during her reign. The infant mortality rate was horrifyingly high. Most of those children died because 18th century medicine could not keep orphans alive. But the intention was progressive. She separated church and state education, removing religious control from schools. She established the first Russian law about religious tolerance, allowing Muslims to build mosques. When Christian leaders in Kazan complained that the mosques were being built too high, higher than churches, they asked Catherine to prohibit this. Her response was brilliant. She said she was the Serena of the Russian land, but the sky was beyond her jurisdiction, basically telling them to deal with it. That showed genuine tolerance, genuine, enlightened thinking. But these were small victories compared to the big failures. The Nakaz went nowhere. The Legislative Commission was eventually suspended in 1768 when war with Turkey provided a convenient excuse. Most of Catherine's proposed legal reforms never happened, and the biggest issue, serfdom, actually got worse under her rule. Let me read you something. Voltaire wrote to Catherine in 1771. He said, "I consider you the benefactor of Europe, the benefactors of Europe." That is what the leading thinker of the Enlightenment called her. But at that exact moment, Russian serfs were living in conditions that would shock any rational humanitarian. They had no legal rights, could be beaten, raped, sold, worked to death. And Catherine, the benefactor of Europe, was giving more power to the people who owned them. Was Voltaire naive, or was he just so invested in the idea of the enlightened monarch that he ignored the reality? Because Voltaire never visited Russia, never saw what Russian serfdom actually looked like. He knew Catherine through letters, through her writings, through the image she projected, and that image was carefully curated. Catherine was brilliant at public relations. She understood that controlling her reputation in Europe was almost as important as controlling Russia. So she wrote the NAR knowing it would be published in France and circulated among the philosophes. She corresponded with Voltaire and did knowing those letters would be shared and discussed. She was creating a brand, Catherine the Enlightened, and it worked. European intellectuals loved her. They held her up as proof that enlightened despotism could work. But inside Russia, different story. The nobles saw her as one of them, protecting their privileges. The serf saw her as their oppressor. The church saw her as a secular ruler who could not be fully trusted. Catherine was different things to different audiences. That is politics at the highest level. Now, Diderot actually did visit Russia in 1773. Catherine had bought his library when he was in financial trouble, allowed him to keep using it, and paid him to be its librarian. It was a generous gesture, and Diderot came to St. Petersburg to thank her personally and to give her advice on governance. They had long conversations about reform, about enlightenment, principles, about how to improve Russia, and Diderot was shocked by what he found. Not by Catherine, he liked her personally, but by the reality of Russian autocracy. He tried to convince her to establish something like a constitutional monarchy, to create checks on her power, to give people more rights. And Catherine listened politely, but she did not implement any of it. Later, she wrote that Dido's ideas were fine for philosophy but impossible in practice. She said, "You work only on paper, which endures all things, but I, poor Empress, work on human skin, which is far more irritable and ticklish." That quote reveals everything. Human skin is irritable and ticklish, meaning real people resist change. They have interests, fears, traditions. You cannot just impose rational reforms from above, because people are not rational. They are emotional, tribal, self-interested, and governing them requires working within those constraints. But is that true, or is it an excuse? Because other societies have made dramatic changes. The American Revolution happened in 1776, right in the middle of Catherine's reign. 13 colonies threw off monarchy entirely and created a republic based on Enlightenment principles. It was messy and imperfect and excluded most people initially, but it showed that radical change was possible. Catherine could have tried harder. She could have used her absolute power to force change, but she chose not to because forcing change would have risked her position. And here is the brutal honesty. Catherine valued her power more than her principles. When the conflicted, power won. That does not make her evil. It makes her human, but it does make her less than the enlightened ideals she projected. Think about this in modern terms. How many leaders talk about progressive values while maintaining systems that contradict those values? How many politicians campaign on change and then govern to preserve their own position? How many people espouse ideals they are not willing to sacrifice for? Catherine was not unique in this. She was just doing it at an empire-defining scale. But there is something almost tragic about Catherine's Enlightenment, period, about those early years when she really believed she could transform Russia through reason. You can see it in her early letters to Voltaire, the enthusiasm, the idealism. And then you can watch year by year as that idealism gets worn down by reality, by noble resistance, by peasant revolts, by wars, by the sheer difficulty of changing a massive traditional empire. By the 1770s, Catherine had largely given up on major reforms. She still talked about Enlightenment principles, still corresponded with philosophers, still patronized the arts and sciences. But the radical transformation she had envisioned, it was not happening, could not happen, not without a revolution. And Catherine was not going to start a revolution against herself. So instead, she focused on what she could control: territorial expansion, military strength, cultural patronage, administrative efficiency, things that made Russia stronger without requiring fundamental social change. And in those areas, she succeeded brilliantly. Russia became a major European power under her reign. She added vast territories. She won wars. She made St. Petersburg a cultural capital. But the cost was borne by the people at the bottom, the serfs, the peasants, the people who worked the land and had no rights, no voice, no hope of improvement, and their suffering would eventually explode into violence, because you cannot oppress millions of people indefinitely, even with all the power of the state behind you. Eventually, they resist. Eventually, they fight back. And when they did, Catherine's response showed exactly where her priorities lay, because when faced with the largest peasant rebellion in Russian history, led by a man claiming to be her dead husband, Catherine did not respond with enlightened mercy or rational justice. She responded with overwhelming force and brutal repression, and that is where we are headed next, to a moment that tested everything Catherine claimed to believe and revealed the iron fist underneath the velvet glove. There is a word that appears over and over in documents from Catherine's Russia. The word is kreposnoy. It translates to serf. But that translation misses something crucial, because when we hear serf in English, we think of medieval Europe, peasants tied to the land, working for lords, limited freedom, but still human beings with some rights. Russian serfdom in the 18th century was not that. It was something darker, something closer to what Americans would recognize as slavery. And most people have no idea how bad it really was. Let me give you some numbers. First, because the scale is staggering. In 1762, when Catherine became Empress, roughly half of Russia's population, about 20 million people, were serfs. 20 million. That is more than the entire population of many European countries at the time. And these were not just agricultural workers with limited mobility. These were people who were legally owned property. They could be bought and sold like furniture. But here is where it gets worse than medieval European serfdom. In most of Europe, serfs were tied to the land. You could not sell the land without the serfs, and you could not sell the serfs without the land. They went together. It created a kind of stability, not freedom, but at least predictability. In Russia, nobles could sell serfs separately from the land. They could sell individual people, breaking up families. A mother could be sold to one estate, her children to another, her husband to a third. Legally, routinely. Imagine being a serf. You wake up one morning and your owner has gambling debts, so he sells you, just you. Your wife and children stay behind. You're taken hundreds of miles away to a different estate to work for a different master. You'll probably never see your family again. And this was not rare. This happened constantly. There were markets where serfs were sold, advertisements in newspapers listing serfs for sale like livestock. Here is an actual advertisement from a Russian newspaper in the 1760s. For sale, a girl of 16 years trained in sewing and cooking. Also a blacksmith aged 40 with strong constitution. People being sold like tools, and this was completely normal, completely legal. Now, under Catherine's rule, the nobles got even more power over their serfs. In 1765, just 3 years into her reign, Catherine gave nobles the right to sentence their serfs to hard labor in Siberia. Read that again. A private citizen, a noble, could sentence another human being to Siberia. That was a punishment usually reserved for criminals convicted in a court of law. But now, if your owner decided you were troublesome, or if he just did not like you, he could send you to Siberia. No trial, no appeal, just exile to one of the harshest environments on earth. The only thing a noble could not legally do was kill a serf because, technically, the serf's life belonged to the state, not to the individual owner. But in practice, nobles beat serfs to death and called it an accident. They worked them to death and said they were weak. They raped serf women with impunity. The legal protection was essentially meaningless. And here is the part that really reveals the horror. Serfs had no legal recourse, none. If your owner beat you, you could not go to the police. The police worked for the nobles. If your daughter was raped, you could not go to court. The courts would not hear your case. If your land was taken, your possessions stolen, your family separated, there was nothing you could do. You had no rights. You were property. Catherine knew this. She had read Enlightenment philosophy. She had corresponded with thinkers who argued passionately against slavery and oppression. Voltaire himself had written about the dignity of all human beings, and Catherine claimed to agree. But when she had the chance to actually do something about serfdom, she made it worse. Let me give you a specific example. Between 1762 and 1796, Catherine gave away approximately 800,000 state peasants to nobles as rewards for service. 800,000 people. These were people who'd been relatively free, who worked state lands, who had some limited rights, and Catherine turned them into private serfs. She enslaved 750,000 people, not as a necessary evil, not as a temporary measure, but as gifts, rewards, incentives for loyalty. Why? Because the nobles were her power base. They had supported her coup against Peter. They ran the local governments. They commanded the armies. And they wanted more serfs because serfs were wealth. More serfs meant more agricultural production, more income, more labor for building estates and roads and infrastructure. The entire economy ran on serf labor. And if Catherine tried to limit or abolish serfdom, the nobles would turn against her. So she did not just maintain the system, she strengthened it. Now let us compare this to American slavery, because I think it helps us understand just how brutal Russian serfdom was. American slavery was hoary, ick. Enslaved people had no freedom, were treated as property. suffered unspeakable violence and family separation. It was an abomination. But there were some differences that made Russian serfdom equally bad, maybe worse in certain ways. First scale, at its peak, American slavery involved about 4 million enslaved people. Russian serfdom involved 20 million, 5 times as many. Second, duration. American slavery lasted roughly 250 years from the colonial period to the Civil War. Russian serfdom lasted over 300 years and was not fully abolished until 1861, 4 years before American slavery ended. Third, invisibility. American slavery is widely taught, widely remembered, widely acknowledged as a moral catastrophe. Russian serfdom, most people outside of Russia have barely heard of it, but here is where they were similar. The dehumanization, the violence, the way systems of power justified oppression by claiming the oppressed were naturally inferior, naturally suited to servitude. American slaveholders said black people were less than human. Russian nobles said serfs were like children incapable of self-governance, needing firm control. It is the same logic, the same evil dressed in different language. And just like in America, where enslaved people resisted in countless ways, running away, sabotage, occasional revolts, Russian serfs resisted too, constantly. Between 1762 and 1769, there were over 50 documented peasant revolts. 50 in 7 years. These were not small disturbances. These were hundreds or thousands of serfs rising up, attacking noble estates, sometimes killing their owners, trying to fight for freedom. Catherine's response: brutal suppression. Send in the army. Execute the leaders. Fog the participants, increase surveillance and control. She did not see these revolts as a sign that the system was unjust. She saw them as threats to order that needed to be crushed. And rushed they were. But the revolts kept happening because you cannot oppress millions of people indefinitely without resistance. Human beings have a breaking point. And Russian serfs were being pushed past it, constantly. The working conditions were brutal. Serfs typically had to work their owner's land 3 days a week, plus additional labor obligations. But many nobles demanded more. 4 days, 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week, leaving barely any time for serfs to work their own plots to feed their families. And the punishments for not meeting obligations: public flogging, sometimes hundreds of lashes. People died from these beatings. Women were flogged as well as men. Children as young as 10 or 12 could be beaten for not working fast enough. This was not ancient history. This was happening while Benjamin Franklin was writing about liberty in America, while Mozart was composing in Austria, while Enlightenment thinkers were celebrating human reason and dignity. In Russia, millions of people were living in conditions that would horrify anyone with a conscience. Catherine rationalized this. She told herself and her correspondents in France that Russian serfs were not ready for freedom, that there was too backward, too uneducated, too prone to chaos, that they needed the firm hand of noble control or they would descend into anarchy. This is what oppressors always say, right? The oppressed are not ready for freedom. They need us to control them for their own good. It is the same excuse used by every empire, every slave society, every authoritarian regime. But here is what Catherine would not admit. The reason serfs seemed backward and uneducated was because the system kept them that way deliberately. Serfs were forbidden from receiving formal education in most cases. They were kept illiterate. They were not allowed to travel without permission. They were isolated on estates, cut off from broader society. And their nobles looked at them and said, "See, they are ignorant. They cannot govern themselves." It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. There were a few nobles who questioned the system. Alexander Adishov wrote a book called A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow in 1790 that openly criticized serfdom and called it slavery. Catherine had him arrested and exiled to Siberia because she could not tolerate criticism of the system her power depended on, even if that criticism came from Enlightenment principles she claimed to share. Do you see the moral gymnastics here? Catherine reads, Voltaire and Montesquieu, and nods along with their ideas about liberty and justice. She incorporates those ideas into the Naz. She presents herself to Europe as an enlightened ruler, but when someone in Russia says, "Hey, maybe we should actually apply these principles to the serfs," she has him arrested. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, and the serfs knew it. They were not stupid. They could see that Catherine talked about justice while denying them any. They could see nobles living in luxury built on their suffering. They could see the contradiction, and they were angry, furious, desperate, and that desperation was building toward an explosion. There is this concept in social movements called relative deprivation. It means that people do not revolt when things are at their absolute worst. They revolt when things are bad, but they can imagine them being better when they see that change is possible. And in the 1760s and early 1770s, Russian serfs could see that they had heard rumors about Catherine's Naz, about proposals for limiting serfdom. They had heard about peasant revolts in other regions. They knew that somewhere, somehow, people were fighting back, and it gave them hope, dangerous hope. By 1773, the warning signs were everywhere. Revolts were increasing. More serfs were running away. The Kosks on the frontier were restless. The government was stretched thin from wars with Turkey. The conditions were perfect for a massive uprising, and all it needed was a spark, a leader, someone who could unite all that anger and desperation into a movement. And in September 1773, they found one, or rather he found them. A Cossack named Emelian Pugachev appeared in the Ural region and made an announcement that shocked Russia to its core. He claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. The murdered emperor miraculously survived and returned to reclaim his throne. And thousands upon thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and peasants believed him, or at least they wanted to believe him, because here is the genius of what Pugachev did. He did not just promise to overthrow Catherine. He promised to abolish serfdom entirely, to give the land to the peasants, to execute the nobles, to create a world where the people at the bottom were finally free. It was a revolutionary message, and it spread like wildfire across the Russian countryside. Within months, Pugachev had an army, a real army, tens of thousands of followers, and they were marching toward the heart of Russia. Catherine had faced threats before, political rivals, foreign enemies, court conspiracies, but this was different. This was the oppressed rising up. This was the system she had strengthened turning against her. This was her worst nightmare, because if Pugachev succeeded, if the serfs actually won, everything she had built would collapse. Her reign, her legacy, her life, all of it was suddenly at stake, and her response to this threat would reveal exactly who Catherine really was beneath all the Enlightenment rhetoric. Would she show mercy, understanding, and attempt at reform, or would she show the iron fist that had always been there, hidden under velvet? September 17th, 1773. A man rode into a company sack settlement near the Ural River. He was in his early 42nds, stocky, bearded, scarred. He had the look of someone who had lived hard. And when the Cossacks gathered around him, he made an announcement that would change Russian history. He said, "I am Emperor Peter III. I did not die in 1762. I escaped. I have been in hiding for 11 years, and now I have returned to reclaim my throne and free my people." Now you might be thinking, how could anyone believe this? Peter III had been dead for 11 years. His death was announced. There was a funeral. Everyone knew he was dead. But here is what you need to understand about 18th century Russia. Information traveled slowly. Most peasants and serfs could not read. They had never seen Peter III in person. They only knew him from rumors and descriptions. And more importantly, there was a tradition in Russian culture of the true Tsar, the idea that a good Tsar had been wrongfully deposed or killed, but would return to save the people. This tradition existed because it gave hope. When life under the current ruler was unbearable, people comforted themselves with the fantasy that somewhere the rightful Tsar was alive, waiting to come back and make things right. It happened over and over in Russian history. False Dmitri, claiming to be the murdered son of Ivan the Terrible, false Peters and false Alexios. The true Tsar was always the one who promised what people wanted to hear. And Pugachev understood this perfectly. He was not actually educated, but he was cunning. He was born a Don Cossack, had served in the Russian army, fought in the 7 Years' War and against Turkey. He had deserted in 1771, wandered around, gotten in trouble with authorities. He was nobody, a peasant with military experience and a talent for survival. But he was also charismatic. He could speak to people, make them believe. So when he showed up claiming to be Pete, 3, he did not just make the claim. He backed it up with a story. He said that, on the night he was supposed to be murdered, loyal guards had helped him escape. They killed someone else and passed off the body as his. He had fled, lived in hiding, traveled the country, disguised as a pilgrim. He had seen the suffering of his people under the German usurper Catherine, and now he was back to free them, and critically he made promises. He issued manifestos, official-sounding decrees, abolishing serfdom, giving land to the peasants, eliminating taxes, executing the nobles who had oppressed the people. He painted a picture of a Russia where the serfs were free, the land was theirs, and justice finally existed. Can you imagine hearing this if you were a serf? If your entire life had been suffering and exploitation, of course you would want to believe it. Of course you would follow him. The rebellion started small, a few hundred Cossacks, but it grew incredibly fast. Within a month, Pugachev had several thousand followers. Within 3 months, tens of thousands. They attacked and captured forts, arsenals, small towns. They killed nobles, burned estates, freed serfs who immediately joined the rebellion. It was like a wildfire spreading across the Russian countryside. And here is what made it so dangerous. This was not just a peasant revolt. Pugachev attracted different groups with different grievances. Cossacks who resented government control over their traditional freedoms. Factory workers in the Ural mines who were basically enslaved. Non-Russian ethnic groups, Bashkirs, Kalmyks, Kazakhs, who had been conquered and oppressed by the Russian Empire, old believers, a religious sect that had been persecuted. All these groups saw Pugachev as their liberator. By the summer of 1774, Pugachev's army was massive. Estimates vary, but at its peak, he probably had between 30,000 and 40,000 fighters. And they were not just an angry mob. They had organization, military discipline, artillery. Pugachev set up a court that mimicked the Imperial court in St. Petersburg. He appointed ministers and generals from among his followers. He issued decrees with official seals. He was creating an alternative government. In July 1774, Pugachev captured the city of Kazan. Kazan, that is a major city, one of the oldest and most important in Russia. The rebels stormed it, overwhelmed the defenders, took control. They burned much of the city, killed nobles and officials. It was a catastrophic defeat for Catherine's forces. And suddenly, Pugachev was only about 400 meters from Moscow. The capital itself seemed within reach. Think about what this meant. Catherine had been Empress for 12 years. She had won wars against Turkey. She had expanded the empire. She had established herself as a powerful ruler. And now a Cossack rebel pretending to be her dead husband had captured a major city and was threatening the heart of Russia. The humiliation was profound. The danger was existential. But here is what fascinates me. Catherine's initial response was to dismiss the threat. When reports of Pugachev first reached St. Petersburg in late 1773, she did not take it seriously. She called him an impostor, a bandit, nothing to worry about. She was fighting a war with Turkey at the time and did not want to divert resources. She thought local authorities could handle it. That was a massive miscalculation. By the time she realized how serious this was, by mid-774, Pugachev controlled huge swaths of territory. The rebellion had spread across the Volga region, the Urals, into Siberia. Millions of people were living under Pugachev's rule, or at least outside of Catherine's control. This was not a revolt, this was a civil war. And Catherine was not clearly winning. So she pivoted completely. She pulled back from the war with Turkey and signed a peace treaty, even though she could have gotten better terms by continuing to fight. Why? Because she needed her army home. She needed those experienced soldiers and commanders to fight Pugachev. She made General Alexander Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military leaders, commander of the anti-Pugachev forces. She threw everything at this problem. And slowly, the tide turned. Suvorov was brilliant, ruthless, but brilliant. He did not try to chase Pugachev's entire army. He focused on cutting off supplies, isolating rebel-held territories, targeting Pugachev's key commanders, professional military tactics against what was ultimately a peasant army, however large and motivated. But what really doomed Pugachev was not military defeat. It was betrayal. By September 1774, after the capture of Kazan, Pugachev's forces were being pushed back. They had suffered losses. Supply lines were breaking down. And some of his own Cossack officers started to doubt, started to think, maybe we should cut a deal, save ourselves. On September 14th, 174, a group of Pugachev's own Cossacks arrested him. They tied him up and handed him over to government forces. Just like that, the Great Rebellion collapsed because without their charismatic leader, without the true Tsar, the followers lost hope. Armies started deserting, towns surrendered. Within weeks, it was over. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in a metal cage. Literally, they built a cage on a cart and transported him like an animal, displaying him to crowds along the way. Can you imagine the psychological warfare of that? Showing people, look, your emperor's in a cage. He is powerless. This is what happens to rebels. And then came the trial. It was not really a trial. It was theater. Pugachev was questioned, tortured for information about his supporters. He confessed everything, admitted he was not. Peter III pleaded for mercy. There would be none. On January 10, 1775, in a public square in Moscow, Emelian Pugachev was executed. The method was quartering, being tied to 4 horses. That pulled in different directions, tearing the body apart. It was one of the most brutal execution methods available, reserved for the worst traitors. They wanted to make an example. They wanted everyone to see what happened when you challenged the empire. Except there is a twist. According to some reports, the executioner secretly beheaded Pugachev first before the quartering, a mercy killing. Whether this was compassion or a pragmatic decision to make the execution easier to carry out, we do not know. But if it is true, it suggests that even in this moment of brutal state violence, someone felt a shred of humanity for the condemned man. After Pugachev's execution, Catherine ordered systematic reprisals. Villages that had supported the rebellion were burned. Leaders were hanged. Hundreds, probably thousands of people were executed or sent to Siberia. The message was clear. Revolt against the empire and you will be destroyed. Your families will suffer. Your communities will be erased. But Catherine also tried to erase the memory of the rebellion itself. She renamed the Yaik River, where the rebellion started, to the Ural River. She forbade mentioning Pugachev's name in official documents. She wanted to pretend it had never happened because the rebellion exposed something she could not acknowledge. The system she ruled over was so unjust that millions of people would follow an obvious impostor just for the chance at freedom. Let us think about why this rebellion happened in the first place. Yes, Pugachev was charismatic. Yes, the timing was right with Catherine distracted by war. But the fundamental cause was the brutality of serfdom. If serfs had been treated with basic human dignity, if they had rights, if they had hope for a better future, would they have risked everything to follow Pugachev? Probably not. The rebellion was a message, a scream. Millions of people saying we cannot live like this anymore. We would rather fight and die than continue in slavery. And Catherine's response was not to reform the system. It was to crush the rebellion and strengthen the system even more. After Pugachev, she gave nobles even more power over serfs, made punishments harsher, increased surveillance. The lesson she learned was not we need to treat people better, it was we need better control. Compare this to other moments in history when the oppressed have risen up. The Haitian Revolution starting in 1791, where enslaved people successfully overthrew their masters and created an independent nation. The Spartacus Rebellion in ancient Rome, where gladiators and slaves fought for years against the Roman legions. The various peasant revolts in medieval Europe. What do they all have in common? They were responses to systems of oppression that had become unbearable, and they all forced the ruling classes to confront uncomfortable truths about their power. But here is the thing about Pugachev's rebellion that makes it particularly interesting: the use of legitimacy as a weapon. Pugachev claimed to be the rightful Tsar. He did not argue that the Tsarist system should be abolished. He argued that he was the real Tsar, and Catherine was the user. That is brilliant strategy, because it was not asking people to imagine a completely different system of government, which is psychologically difficult. It was asking them to swap one ruler for another, which was easier to conceptualize, but it also limited the rebellion's revolutionary potential. If Pugachev had succeeded, would he have actually abolished serfdom, created a democratic system, given power to the people, or would he have just become another Tsar ruling through the same authoritarian structures? We will never know. But history suggests that rebellions led by charismatic individuals often just replace one tyrant with another. The other thing Pugachev's rebellion reveals is how fragile authoritarian legitimacy really is. Catherine had absolute power, on paper. But when a Cossack nobody claimed to be the true ruler, tens of thousands of people believed him, or at least they were willing to act as if they believed him, because legitimacy is not about legal right. It is about perception. If enough people stop believing in your authority, you do not have authority anymore. You just have force, and force alone cannot hold an empire together forever. Catherine understood this. That is why she worked so hard to control her image, to correspond with philosophers, to project enlightenment and culture, because she knew her legitimacy was shaky. She was a foreign bee-born woman who had overthrown her husband. She had no hereditary claim to the throne in the traditional sense. Her power came from a coup and from maintaining the support of the nobility and military. If that support ever wavered, she would be vulnerable. Pugachev exploited that vulnerability. He showed that an alternative was possible, that people could imagine Russia without Catherine. And even though he failed, even though he was executed in that horrible way, the fear he created stayed with Catherine for the rest of her reign. She never forgot how close she came to losing everything, how quickly an empire could unravel when the people at the bottom decided they had nothing left to lose. But if you think the brutality of serfdom and the crushing of Pugachev's rebellion represent the darkest parts of Catherine's legacy, well, we are not done yet, because we need to talk about what Catherine actually built during her reign. The cultural achievements, the institutions, the cities, the art, the things she is actually celebrated for. Because there is a profound contradiction at the heart of Catherine's Russia. How did one of history's most oppressive societies also produce one of its most magnificent cultural flowerings? How can a nation built on slavery create such beauty? And what does that tell us about the relationship between oppression and art, between suffering and culture? Walk with me through the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg circa 1790. Your footsteps echo on marble floors. The ceilings soar above you, covered in fresco and gold leaf. You turn a corner and enter a gallery, and then you stop, because hanging on the walls in front of you are paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, Raphael, Titian, Van Dyck, some of the greatest masterpieces ever created by human hands, all collected by one woman, Catherine the Great, and this is just one room. there are hundreds more. The Hermitage Museum began as Catherine's private collection, and when I say collection, I mean obsession. Catherine did not just buy art, she devoured it. She competed with other European monarchs to acquire the best pieces, the rarest works, the most significant collections, and she won. By the time she died in 1796, she owned approximately 4,000 paintings, 10,000 engraved gems, 10,000 drawings, and countless sculptures and decorative arts. It was the largest private art collection in the world. But here is what gets me. She actually bought her first major collection site unseen. In 1764, just 2 years into her reign, she heard that a Berlin merchant named Johann Gotskowski had assembled a collection of 225 paintings for Frederick the Great of Prussia. But Frederick could not afford to pay for them because he was broke from the 7 Years' War. So Catherine swooped in and bought the entire collection, 225 paintings. She had never seen them. She just wanted them before anyone else could have them. That is power move energy right there. And it was not just about owning beautiful things. Catherine understood the tea culture was political. Art was legitimacy. If Russia had the finest art collection, in Europe, if St. Petersburg rivaled Paris and Vienna as a cultural center, then Russia was not some backward frontier empire. It was civilized, sophisticated, worthy of respect. Catherine was using paintings and sculptures to make a statement about Russia's place in the world. But here is where it gets morally complicated. Where did the money come from? Serf labor, taxes collected from oppressed, peasants. The beauty in those galleries was built on suffering. Every Rembrandt hanging on the wall represented resources extracted from people who had no freedom, no rights, no say in how their labor was used. The cultural flowering was inseparable from the exploitation that funded it. This is a pattern throughout history, is it not? The pyramids of Egypt were built by slave labor. The Parthenon in Athens was constructed by a society that enslaved a third of its population. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were funded by peasants who could barely feed themselves. Renaissance art was commissioned by oligarchs who ruled through violence and corruption. Beauty and brutality have always walked hand in hand. But does knowing that change how we see the art? Should it? If you stand in front of a Rembrandt in the Hermitage today, does it matter that it was purchased with money from a slave economy? Or is the art somehow separate from its context, beautiful regardless of its origins? These are not easy questions, and I do not have simple answers, but I think we have to sit with the discomfort of them. Now, let us talk about education, because this is where Catherine's contradictions become even more apparent. In 1764, the same year she bought that first art collection, Catherine founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls in St. Petersburg. And this was genuinely revolutionary. It was the first state-funded institution for higher education for women in Europe, not just in Russia, in all of Europe. Think about that for a second. Women in the 18th century were not supposed to need education beyond basic literacy, maybe some music and dancing. The idea of women studying science, philosophy, mathematics, languages, that was radical, dangerous even, because educated women might start questioning their subordinate status. They might want power, autonomy, rights, and Catherine created an institution to educate them. Anyway, the small institute started with noble girls only. They entered at age 6 and stayed until they were 18, 12 years of intensive education. They studied French, German, arithmetic, geography, history, drawing, music, dancing. They learned impeccable manners. They were taught to think, to read, to engage with ideas, and yes, they were also taught to revere the Empress. Catherine understood that educating women who would then be loyal to her created a network of influence throughout Russian society. But here is the limitation. It was only for nobles. Serfs could not attend. Merchant-class girls were excluded for years. So Catherine was advancing women's education, but only for the elite. She was not challenging the fundamental class structure. She was not saying all women deserve education. She was saying noble women deserve education because they need to be proper wives and mothers for the ruling class. It was progressive within very narrow bounds. Still, the impact was real. Women who graduated from Smalley became teachers, themselves spreading education further. Some became writers, translators, salon hostesses who shaped intellectual culture. Catherine had opened a door, even if it was only a crack. And sometimes a crack is enough for light to get in. Then there is the Moscow Orphanage, founded in 1764. This project reveals both Catherine's genuine compassion and the brutal limits of 18th century medicine and social welfare. The idea was beautiful. Take in abandoned children, illegitimate, children orphans from the streets, give them food, shelter, education, train them in trade so they could become productive citizens, create a new generation lifted out of poverty through state intervention. Catherine was personally invested in this. She provided funding, visited the orphanage, took interest in its operations, and over the course of her reign, the Moscow Orphanage admitted more than 40,000 children. 40,000. That is an astonishing number for an 18th century institution. It shows scale, ambition, commitment, but the mortality rate was catastrophic. Most estimates suggest that between 75 and 85% of the children admitted to the orphanage died. 75 to 85%. Of those 40,000 children, probably 30,000 to 35,000 died there from disease, malnutrition, the general inability of 18th century medicine to keep infant mortality low, even in the best conditions, and orphanages were not the best conditions. So was the Moscow Orphanage a success or a failure? It saved thousands of children who would have otherwise died on the streets, but it also became in effect a death sentence for many others. The intentions were good. The execution was in many ways a tragedy, and Catherine knew this. She received reports about the mortality rates. She tried reforms, better ventilation, more nurses, different feeding practices. Nothing really worked, but she kept the orphanage running because what was the alternative? Let those children die on the streets instead. This is the complexity of evaluating historical figures. Catherine did something that was ahead of its time, state-funded care for orphans. But the results were mixed at best, horrific at worst. Do we give her credit for trying or condemn her for the deaths? Both, probably both. Let M.E. tell you about another economic innovation that shows Catherine's practical side, the introduction of paper money. Before 1769, Russia's economy ran on silver and gold coins. But Catherine's military campaigns were expensive. Wars with Turkey, the costs of administering new territories, the expenses of her cultural projects, it all drained the treasury. There was not enough silver and gold in circulation for people to conduct large transactions. So Catherine created the Assignation Bank in 1769 and started issuing paper rubles. This was not unique to Russia. Other countries had paper money, but it was new for Russia and represented a significant modernization. Paper money made trade easier, allowed for larger transactions, helped the economy function more smoothly. The assignation ruble would remain in use until 1843, long after Catherine's death. That is lasting impact. But of course, like everything else, this benefited the merchant and noble classes far more than it helped serfs. Serfs were not conducting large financial transactions. They were not participating in the money economy in meaningful ways. So even this economic modernization reinforced existing inequalities. Now let us talk about architecture, because Catherine transformed St. Petersburg physically. She commissioned dozens of major buildings in the neoclassical style. The Hermitage building itself, the Academy of Arts, the Marble Palace, expansions of the Winter Palace. She brought in architects from across Europe. She wanted St. Petersburg to look like the great European capitals, like Paris, like Vienna, like Rome. And she succeeded. If you walk through St. Petersburg today, You're walking through Catherine's vision. Those grand boulevards, those imposing facades, those palaces as monuments. They are her legacy made stone. It is genuinely beautiful. One of the most architecturally stunning cities in the world. But who built those buildings? Serfs, forced labor, men who worked on construction projects as part of their obligations to the state or to nobles. They carved the stone, laid the foundations, created the beauty, and they were not paid fairly, not honored, not remembered. Their names are not on plaques. They are invisible in the historical record, but without them, none of it would exist. There is a famous story about Catherine visiting a construction site for one of her projects. She asked a worker what he was doing. He said, "I am earning my bread." She asked another worker the same question. He said, "I am laying bricks." She asked a third worker, and he said, "I am building a cathedral." Catherine supposedly praised the third worker for understanding the larger vision. But I think about that first worker, the one just trying to earn bread. That was probably the most honest answer. Most people building Catherine's vision were just trying to survive. Catherine also established the Russian Academy of Arts, founded in 1757, but reorganized and expanded under her patronage. She created scholarships for talented students to study in Europe. She commissioned Russian artists for major works. She was trying to create a homegrown Russian artistic tradition, not just import European culture. And this had lasting impact. Russian art, music, and literature in the 19th century built on foundations Catherine helped establish. But again, access was limited. Serf children could not attend the academy. Poor children from merchant families had little chance. The cultural renaissance Catherine fostered was for the elite. It did not reach down to the masses. So, here is the question I keep coming back to. Was Catherine's cultural legacy real progress, or was it performative? Was she genuinely trying to elevate Russian civilization, or was she just buying prestige? And does it matter if the results were the same? I think it was both. Catherine genuinely loved art, ideas, culture. Her letters show real engagement with philosophical questions, real appreciation for beauty. But she also understood the political value of culture. She knew that being seen as enlightened increased her legitimacy in Europe, made her harder to dismiss or attack. The personal and the political were intertwined in ways that probably cannot be separated. Compare Catherine's cultural patronage to that of other monarchs. Louis XIV of France built Versailles and patronized artists not just for beauty but to centralize power and impress rivals. The Medici Florence supported Renaissance art partly from genuine love of beauty and partly to legitimize their rule. Elizabeth I of England used pageantry and art to craft her image as the Virgin Queen and unite England. Power and culture have always been connected, but there is something particularly striking about Catherine's situation. She was an outsider, German-born, not Russian by blood. She came to power through a coup and possible murder. Her legitimacy was always questionable, so she had to work harder than most monarchs to establish her place. And culture was one of the tools she used. Every painting she acquired, every building she commissioned, every intellectual she corresponded with was partly about saying, "I belong here. I am worthy. Russia under my rule is great," and it worked. The term Catherinian era is still used to describe a golden age of Russian culture. Her reign is remembered as a high point. The art she collected is still displayed in the Hermitage. The buildings she commissioned still stand. The institution she founded still exists in various forms. That is legacy. That is impact. But it is legacy built on contradiction, built on the labor of people who had no freedom, built with money extracted from oppressed population, built by a woman who claimed enlightened values while strengthening the most oppressive social system in Europe. How do we hold all of that complexity? How do we appreciate the beauty while acknowledging the brutality? Maybe the answer is that we do not resolve the contradiction. We live with it. We recognize that history is messy, that people contain multitudes, that good and evil are not always separate. Catherine was capable of genuine cultural vision and genuine cruelty, of enlightened thinking and oppressive action, of creating beauty and enabling suffering. She was, in other words, deeply human, complicated, contradictory, real. But there is one part of Catherine's story that has overshadowed almost everything else we've talked about. One set of rumors and legends that have become more famous than her actual accomplishments. And most of them are lies, vicious, sexist lies designed to humiliate and diminish her. And we need to talk about them, because the way Catherine has been portrayed in popular culture, the myths that have been spread about her for over 2 centuries, tell us as much about our society as they do about hers. Let me ask you a question. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the name Catherine the Great? Be honest. For a lot of people, unfortunately, it is not the territorial expansion or the art collection or the Enlightenment ideals. It is a rumor, a disgusting, false rumor about how she died, the horse rumor. And I am going to tell you right now, it is completely, totally, 100% false. Catherine the Great did not die having sex with a horse. She died of a stroke in her bed, fully clothed, surrounded by servants at age 67. But that rumor has persisted for over 200 years. It shows up in movies, TV shows, jokes, casual conversation. People repeat it like it is fact, and every time it gets repeated, it does exactly what it was designed to do. It turns one of history's most accomplished female rulers into a punchline, into a deviant, into a joke. And that is not an accident. That is the point. So where did this rumor come from? We do not know exactly, but it emerged shortly after Catherine's death in 1796. Probably started in France, spread by her political enemies and by people who resented Russian power. And it stuck because it was salacious, shocking, the kind of story people want to repeat because it is outrageous. Never mind that it makes no logical sense. Never mind that there is zero evidence. Never mind that the actual circumstances of her death are well demented. The lie was more entertaining than the truth. Here is what actually happened on November 17, 1796. Catherine woke up that morning feeling fine. She went to her dressing room as usual, and then she suffered a massive stroke and collapsed. Her servants found her unconscious on the floor. They carried her to her bed. Doctors were called. They tried bloodletting, which was the standard useless treatment of the time. Catherine never regained consciousness. She died that evening, around 9:45 p.m. That is it. That is the actual story. Boring, right? No scandal, no drama, just an elderly woman dying of a stroke, which is how millions of people have died throughout history. But the truth could not compete with the lie, because the lie served a purpose. It said this woman had too much power, too much freedom, too much sexual agency. And look what happened to her. Divine punishment, karmic justice. She died in the most humiliating way possible, because she deserved it for transgressing proper female behavior. The rumor was not about what actually happened. It was about what people wished had happened, because it confirmed their prejudices. And it is not just the horse rumor. There is another legend that has circulated for years about an erotic furniture room that Catherine supposedly had at the Gattina Palace. According to this story, she had a secret room filled with furniture, decorated with giant penises and vulvas, tables with penises for legs, walls covered in pornographic art, statues of naked figures engaging in every possible sex act, the whole room supposedly designed for orgies or voyeurism or whatever scandalous purpose people wanted to imagine. The story goes that 2 Wehrmacht officers saw this room when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. They filed a report, but conveniently, no one has ever found that report. No photographs exist. No inventory from the palace mentions such a room. No documentation from before, during, or after World War II confirms it. The only evidence is the legend itself, passed around and embellished with each retelling. Could such a room have existed? I suppose technically anything is possible. But think about the logistics. Catherine was a public figure. whose palaces had hundreds of staff members, servants, guards, officials, visitors. How would she keep a whole room of pornographic furniture secret? Why would she need to? She was the Empress. She could do what she wanted, privately. Creating an elaborate showpiece room makes no sense unless it was meant to be seen. And if it was meant to be seen, where are the contemporary accounts? The most likely explanation is that the story is invented, or perhaps based on a tiny grain of truth. Maybe Catherine owned some art depicting classical mythology with nudity, which was common in 18th century aristocratic collections, and that got exaggerated into this elaborate fantasy of a sex dungeon for an empress because people wanted to believe Catherine was that debauched. It confirmed the narrative. Here is another one. The legend that Catherine kept her hairdresser locked in a cage to prevent her from revealing the secrets of her elaborate wigs. This is absurd on multiple levels. First, if Catherine wanted to keep someone quiet, she had actual prisons in Siberia. She did not need to keep them in a decorative cage like a pet bird. Second, hairstyling was not some state secret. Every noble woman at court had elaborate hairstyles. It was the fashion. There was no secret to protect. But again, the rumor persists because it paints Catherine as tyrannical and vain, as a woman so obsessed with her appearance that she would imprison someone to protect her beauty routine. It plays into stereotypes about women and vanity, about women and pettiness, and it diminishes her actual accomplishments by focusing on trivial matters. Then there is the claim that Catherine advocated for having sex 6 times a day. Where does that number come from? No credible source. It is just something people say, usually with a wink and a nudge, as if it proves she was a nymomaniac. But think about it logically. Catherine ruled an empire. She read voraciously. She wrote letters and manifestos and legislation. She attended to state business, met with advisors, dealt with military campaigns and diplomatic crisis. When exactly would she have time for sex 6 times a day? The claim is ridiculous, but it gets repeated anyway. Why? Why do these rumors persist when they are so obviously false? Because they serve an important function for people who want to undermine powerful women. They shift the conversation away from what Catherine accomplished to what she supposedly did in private. They make her sexuality the most interesting thing about her instead of her reign. They reduce a complex, brilliant, consequential historical figure to a collection of sexual rumors. And this is not unique to Catherine. This happens to powerful women throughout history, and today, Cleopatra is remembered more for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony than for her political acumen and successful rule of Egypt for decades. Marie Antoinette is defined by false quotes like, "Let them eat cake," and scandalous rumors about her private life rather than the complex political situation she navigated. Anne Boleyn's entire legacy is overshadowed by sexual accusations that were probably invented to justify her execution. In modern times, we see the same pattern. Female politicians face questions about their appearance, their relationships, their families in ways male politicians do not. Their voices are criticized as too shrill or too soft. Their clothing choices are analyzed. Rumors about their private lives circulate on social media. The tactics have updated, but the goal is the same. Undermine women in power by making their gender and sexuality the issue instead of their competence. Now, let us talk about the men who spread these rumors about Catherine. Frederick the Great, whom we've mentioned before, said about her, "A woman is always a woman, and in feminine government that has more influence than a firm policy guided by straight reason." That is a quote from one of the most powerful men in Europe about a woman who repeatedly outmaneuvered him politically and militarily. He could not defeat her, so he tried to diminish her with crude sexism, and it worked to an extent. Those attitudes spread. They became conventional wisdom. They shaped how Catherine was remembered. Even today, if you Google Catherine the Great, the autocomplete suggestions include terms related to the horse rumor and sexual scandals before they include her actual accomplishments. That is Frederick's legacy. That is what misogyny does. It outlasts the people who spread it and becomes embedded in the historical record. Catherine's own son, Emperor Paul II, hated his mother, for various reasons. She had kept him from power. She may have questioned his legitimacy. Their relationship was cold, and after she died, one of his first acts was to pass a law forbidding women from ever ascending to the Russian throne again. Think about the symbolism. His mother had ruled successfully for 34 years. She had expanded the empire, strengthened Russia, created cultural institutions, navigated complex international politics. And his response was to ensure no woman could ever do it again. That law stayed in effect until the Russian monarchy was abolished in 1917. For over a century, no woman could be Empress of Russia in her own right. All because Paul could not handle the fact that his mother was more capable than he was. And Paul's brief reign from 1796 to 1801 was chaotic and ended with his assassination in a coup. So the woman he tried to erase from legacy accomplished more in 1 year than he did in his entire reign. But the sexist law remained. The Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, writing in the 19th century, called Catherine a tatov in skirts, a hypocrite who pretended to be enlightened but was just power-hungry. He focused on the contradictions in her reign which are real and worth examining. But notice the language in skirts. He had to gender it, had to make it about her being a woman pretending to be something she was not. Male rulers who were hypocritical, and there were plenty, were not described as tarts in trousers. The hypocrisy was not gendered for them. So let us be clear about what these rumors and insults represent. They are a coordinated centuries-long campaign to undermine Catherine's legacy by focusing on her gender and invented sexual scandals instead of her actual reign, and it has been devastatingly effective. Ask a random person on the street what they know about Catherine the Great, and they are more likely to mention false sex scandals than the fact that she added 20,000 square miles to the Russian Empire. More likely to laugh about imagined deviancy than to discuss her correspondence with Voltaire, more likely to repeat disgusting lies than to acknowledge her genuine accomplishments. And here is what makes me angry about this. Catherine was not perfect. We have spent this entire story examining her flaws, her hypocrisies, her failures, the nakaz that went nowhere, the serfdom that got worse, the brutal suppression of Pugachev's rebellion, the gap between her Enlightenment ideals and her oppressive actions. These are real criticisms based on real historical facts. We should examine them. We should hold Catherine accountable for her choices and their consequences. But that is not what the sex scandals do. They do not offer legitimate criticism. They offer mockery and diminishment. They say, never mind what she actually did. Let us talk about what we imagine she did in private. Let us make her a joke. Let us make her less than human. And that is not historical analysis. That is character assassination. The tragedy is that Catherine anticipated this. She knew the gossip, the rumors, the whispers. She knew that being a woman in power made her vulnerable to this kind of attack in ways male rulers were not, and she tried to counter it through accomplishments, through cultural patronage, through creating a legacy so significant it could not be ignored. She tried to be so obviously great that the slander would not stick, and to some extent she succeeded. She is called Catherine the Great, after all. That title means something. It acknowledges her impact. But the fact that we still have to debunk the horse rumor over 200 years later shows that she did not fully succeed. The misogyny was too strong, too persistent, too useful for too many people. So the next time someone brings up the horse rumor at a party, shut it down. Correct them. No, that is false. She died of a stroke, and she ruled Russia for 34 years, expanded the empire massively, patronized the arts, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and transformed her adopted country into a major European power. Those are the facts. The sex scandals are propaganda. Because here is the thing. We get to choose which stories we repeat. We get to decide whether we perpetuate lies or whether we demand truth. And every time we repeat a false rumor about Catherine, we are participating in the very sexism that created those rumors in the first place. We are saying that powerful women deserve to be mocked and diminished, that their accomplishments matter less than salacious gossip. I refuse to do that. And I hope after listening to this story you refuse too. Catherine the Great deserves to be judged on what she actually did. The good and the bad, the progressive and the oppressive, the brilliant and the brutal. She deserves historical accuracy, not historical slander. She deserves to be taken seriously as one of the most significant rulers of the 18th century, regardless of gender. And she deserves better than to be remembered primarily for lies told by men who could not handle a woman being more powerful than they were. So now we come to the end of this journey. We have traveled from a freezing castle in Prussia, where a poor German princess was born, through 18 years of humiliation and preparation, through a brilliant coup and a suspicious death, through lovers and wars and rebellions and cultural achievements. We have seen Catherine at her best and at her worst. We've examined her ideals and her betrayals, her accomplishments and her failures. And now we have to answer the hardest question of all. What is her legacy? How should we remember Catherine the Great? Was she truly great, or was she a brilliant opportunist who succeeded through ruthlessness and luck? Can we celebrate her accomplishments while acknowledging the suffering they were built on? And what lessons does her story hold for us today? November 17th, 1796, the day Catherine died, and in the hours after her death, as word spread through St. Petersburg, something remarkable happened. People wept, not just courtiers who depended on her favor, ordinary people in the streets, merchants, soldiers, servants. They cried for their Empress, the German princess who had become more Russian than Russians. And in that moment, despite everything we've talked about, the contradictions, the failures, the oppression, they recognized that something significant had ended, an era, a vision, of force. So, let us talk about what Catherine actually left behind. Not the myths, not the scandals, but the tangible, measurable legacy, because the numbers are staggering. When Catherine took power in 1762, the Russian Empire covered approximately 6.5 million square miles. When she died in 1796, it covered 6.7 million square miles. She added roughly 200,000 square miles of territory. That is an area larger than modern-day France, larger than California, and she did not acquire it through luck or inheritance. She took it through war, diplomacy, and strategic calculation. The First Russo-Turkish War from 1768 to 1774 gave Russia access to the Black Sea. This was huge. For centuries, Russia had been landlocked in the south, unable to project naval power into the Mediterranean or trade freely with southern Europe. Catherine changed that. The Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanaka in 1774 was one of the most advantageous peace treaties Russia had ever signed. Russia gained ports, gained territory in what is now Ukraine, gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. That last provision would be used for the next century to justify Russian interference in Ottoman affairs. Then came the annexation of Crimea in 1783. Catherine did not just conquer it militarily, she integrated it. She sent PM Pekin to develop the region, build cities, establish infrastructure. Sevastopol became one of Russia's most important naval bases, a position it holds to this day. The geopolitical significance of controlling Crimea cannot be overstated. It gave Russia power projection into the Black Sea and beyond. And then there were the partitions of Poland. This is the darkest part of Catherine's territorial expansion. Poland-Lithuania was one of Europe's major powers, but it was politically weak, divided internally, and Catherine, along with Prussia and Austria, decided to just carve it up. The First partition in 1772, the second in 1793, the third in 1795. By the time they were done, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. It would not reappear on the map until 1918. Was this justified? No. It was pure power politics. Taking territory because you could, because the victim was weak, and divided because your rivals would take it if you did not. It was cynical, brutal imperialism, and Catherine participated fully, taking the largest share of Polish territory. So when we talk about her legacy of expansion, we need to acknowledge this was empire building. This was conquest. This came at the cost of Polish independence and Polish suffering. But from a Russian perspective, Catherine transformed the empire into a dominant European power. When she took the throne, Russia was seen as a backward frontier state. By the time she died, Russia was one of the great powers, a nation that had to be considered in every major European diplomatic and military calculation. That is impact. That is legacy. Now, why did Catherine succeed where other female rulers struggled or failed? Because history is full of queens and empresses who had power but could not hold it, or who held it but could not wield it effectively. Let us compare Mary, the way of England. Bloody Mary tried to reverse the Protestant Reformation and restore Catholicism. She burned hundreds of people at the stake and died hated by her subjects. Her reign was defined by religious violence and failure. Elizabeth Afen, her half-sister, was far more successful, but Elizabeth never married, never took acknowledged lovers, and presented herself as the Virgin Queen. She sacrificed personal life for political survival. Mary, Queen of Scots, was brilliant and charming, but made terrible political decisions, married disastrously, and ended up imprisoned and executed. Maria Theresa of Austria was successful, but she ruled through her husband initially and later through her son, always within the constraints of traditional femininity. Catherine was different. She took power through a coup. She never remarried. She took lovers openly and made them part of her government. She led armies, conducted diplomacy, made war and peace on her own authority. She did not pretend to be a man, but she also did not limit herself to traditionally female roles. She carved out a new space, the female autocrat, who governed as powerfully as any king. And critically, she understood something that many rulers, male or female, fail to grasp. Legitimacy is not given, it is created. She was not the rightful heir by any traditional standard. She was a foreign bee-born coup leader. So she created legitimacy through accomplishment, through expanding the empire, through cultural patronage, through projecting an image of enlightened governance, through winning wars and building alliances. She made herself indispensable, and indispensability as a form of legitimacy. But here is the shadow side. Catherine's success entrenched Russian autocracy for another century. She proved that absolute monarchy could work, that one brillia. Anti-autocrat could govern effectively, and that became the model for future Russian emperors. Her grandson, Alexander II, tried some reforms, but ultimately maintained autocratic control. Nicholas II was brutally repressive. Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861, but was assassinated by revolutionaries. Alexander III reversed reforms. Nicholas II's incompetence led directly to the Russian Revolution. The thread connecting them all was the belief that Russia needed a strong autocrat, that democratic reforms would lead to chaos, that the people were not ready for self-governance. These were the same arguments Catherine made, and because she had been successful with that model, it legitimized autocracy for generations after her. So we have to ask, did Catherine's success doom Russia to autocracy? If she had implemented real democratic reforms, if she had limited her own power, if she had created institutional checks and balances, would Russian history have been different? Would Russia have avoided the catastrophic violence of the 20th century? We cannot know. We cannot play alternate history, but we can recognize that Catherine's choices had consequences that lasted far beyond her lifetime. the system she strengthened, autocratic rule backed by a noble elite oppressing a massive peasant class. That system persisted until it exploded in revolution, and millions of people suffered because of it. Yet here is what complicates the simple narratives. Catherine was probably right that rapid democratic reform in 1760s Russia would have failed, the nobles would have revolted, the country might have descended into civil war. Maybe gradual reform was the only viable path. Maybe she did the best that could be done given the constraints she faced. Or maybe that is just another excuse. Maybe truly great leaders find ways to change systems, not just succeed within them. Maybe Catherine's genius was also her limitation. She was brilliant at wielding power, but could not imagine a world where power was shared. So what can modern leaders learn from Catherine? Several things, I think. First, patience is a strategy. Catherine spent 18 years preparing before she took power. 18 years of learning, building relationships, positioning herself. In our world of instant gratification, that kind of long-term planning seems almost alien, but it works. Strategic patience combined with readiness to act when the moment comes is enormously powerful. Second, legitimacy is constructed. Catherine had no traditional claim to power, so she built legitimacy through accomplishments in image management. Modern leaders do this constantly, whether in politics, business, or any field where authority must be earned rather than inherited. The specific tactics change, but the principle remains. Third, complexity matters. Catherine was not simply good or evil, progressive or reactionary. She was all of those things in different contexts. And understanding that complexity helps us avoid simplistic narratives about our own leaders and situations. The world is messy. Leadership is messy. Simple stories are usually wrong. Fourth, the personal and political are inseparable. Catherine's lovers were also political allies. Her cultural interests served political purposes. Her image management was governance. We like to think we can separate these spheres, but we cannot, and pretending otherwise just makes us naive about how power actually works. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, legacy is not just what you intend, it is what actually results. Catherine intended to be an enlightened ruler. She succeeded in being a powerful one. Those are not the same thing. What we mean to do matters less than what we actually accomplish and what consequences flow from our choices. So, here is my final assessment of Catherine the Great. She was great at accumulating and wielding power. She was great at territorial expansion. She was great at cultural patronage. She was great at political strategy. But she was not great at creating a just society. She was not great at limiting her own power for the benefit of others. She was not great at closing the gap between her ideals and her actions. Does that make her great or not? I think it makes her human, brilliantly, consequentially, frustratingly human. She achieved things that seemed impossible for a poor German princess. She transformed Russia into a major power. She left a cultural legacy that endures, but she also strengthened systems of oppression. She chose power over principle when they conflicted. She caused suffering through her choices and her failures to act. We can acknowledge both. We can say she accomplished extraordinary things and she failed morally in crucial ways. We can appreciate her intelligence while condemning her cruelty. We can learn from her strategic brilliance while rejecting her ethical compromises. Historical figures do not have to be heroes or villains. They can be complex, contradictory, deeply flawed people who nevertheless shaped the world. And Catherine shaped the world, for better and worse, in ways intended, and she left a mark that we are still living with. Russian history cannot be understood without her. European history cannot be told without acknowledging her role and the questions her reign raises, about power and principle, about ends and means, about what we sacrifice for success. Those questions are timeless. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. A 15-year-old girl arrived in a foreign country, barely speaking the language, married to a man who despised her with no power and no prospects. And through patience, intelligence, ruthlessness, and will, she became one of the Mo. powerful rulers in the world. That transformation is remarkable. Regardless of how we judge the results, the fact that it was possible at all tells us something profound about human capability and human complexity. We are capable of extraordinary things. We are capable of terrible things. Often we are capable of both at the same time. And we have choices about which capabilities we develop, which ambitions we pursue, which legacies we leave. Catherine made her choices. History has judged them and will continue to judge them. But understanding her story, really understanding it with all its darkness and light, helps us understand our own potential and our own responsibilities, because power is not inherently good or evil. It is a tool, and the question is always, what do you do with it? Do you use it to free people or to oppress them, to build or to destroy, to close gaps or to widen them? Catherine had more power than almost anyone in her time, and she used it in ways that were both extraordinary and troubling. She could have done more good, she chose not to, and that choice echoes through history, but she also could have done much worse. She could have been a tyrant like Ivan the Terrible. She could have been weak and incompetent like Peter III. She could have squandered opportunities and let Russia decline. She did not. She was effective, capable, and in her own way transformational. That counts for something, even if it does not excuse everything. So here is my question for you as we close. What would you have done in Catherine's position? When faced with the choice between ideals and power, which would you choose? When confronted with the system you could not change without losing everything, would you work within it or against it? These are not hypothetical questions. We all face versions of them in our own lives, at our own scales, and Catherine's story is ultimately about the fact that these questions do not have easy answers. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the hidden reign of Catherine the Great, for sitting with the complexity and the contradictions, for being willing to see her as she really was. Not the myth, not the scandal, but the flawed, brilliant, ruthless, accomplished human being who shaped history through force of will and strategic genius. I hope her story has given you something to think about, some perspective on power and leadership, some questions about your own choices and values, and I hope you will come back for our next story, because history is full of people like Catherine, complex figures who challenge our assumptions and force us to think more deeply about what greatness really means. Until then, sleep well, dream of empires and revolutions, and remember the stories they never taught you in school are often the ones most worth knowing. Good night.